I believe that now we have an important reaction in Washington from a high official in the Kennedy administration. I think we're ready now to switch to Washington, and so for that, let us switch to Edwin Newman in Washington.
Jim, I'd like to repeat what I said before, that a top leader in the Johnson administration has said that the president intends to address a joint session of Congress next week. It is not yet certain whether he will make his appearance on Wednesday or Friday, but it probably will be on Wednesday, and it probably will be a plea for national unity in the difficult period following the assassination of President Kennedy. In the NBC studio is a longtime associate of President Kennedy, a member of his cabinet, and a man who knows President Johnson well, Senator Abraham Ribicoff, Democrat of Connecticut, former governor of Connecticut, former representative from Connecticut, and the first Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in the Kennedy cabinet. Senator Ribicoff, you knew President Kennedy very well. You were one of the key figures in his election as president. And your thoughts today must be particularly sad.
Well, it's been a tragedy. I just came from the White House, where we saw a coffin in repose, and I'll be very, very frank. I never thought I would ever see the day that I would go into the White House for this purpose. The shock and the tragedy is very, very hard to contemplate. This was a vibrant, intelligent man, so full of life. You just can't grasp, Ed, that he's dead.
Senator, what was the scene when you went into the White House, into the East Room where the casket is?
Well, I went in with other senators. We were all accompanied by our wives. Everyone was solemn, deep in his own thoughts and the thoughts and their hearts and prayers to Mrs. Kennedy and the family. And I would say all of us sort of gave a little prayer of rededication to our nation and the support for the new president of the United States, even in the midst of our sorrow for the man who is gone.
Have you seen any members of the Kennedy family apart from
No, I haven't.
Sergeant Shriver?
No, I haven't. Yesterday, of course, I happened to be on the floor when the news came, and Ted Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, had been presiding, ironically, at that time, but I haven't seen any personal members of the family.
Senator, you have been asked, and you will be asked again, because you were so close to Mr. Kennedy. What would you now say to the American people about him? How do you think he will be remembered?
I would say that President Kennedy will always live in the minds and hearts and the affection of the American people. I think one of the most important things about the president is his proof of the basic decency of American life. What I had always contended for, that the American people would take a man based on his ability, his personality, his integrity, and character, and make that choice above the religious beliefs. And this they did. And when President Kennedy came into the White House, everything that everyone had said, he fulfilled. He was really an intellectual giant. I don't think that any man has ever come to the White House with the intellectual qualifications that John F. Kennedy had, Ed. He believed in causes. He wanted to get this country moving again. If it is possible to turn the world to peace, he started it with Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, his patience in the face of many provocations, the Test Ban Treaty. He seemed to start moving the world away from the frozen state that had become it. I think, too, his realization that America was changing, that we were becoming an urbanized nation, the need to accord civil rights to all our people, irrespective of race, creed, and color. His whole program, I predict, will find expression and adoption by this country before too many years, and he is the one who has got it started on that road.
Well, what do you think the immediate effect of President Kennedy's death will be, Senator Ribicoff?
Well, I think that you will find a rallying of the nation behind President Lyndon Johnson. I think, ironical as it may be, his death may even would probably mean the faster adoption of many of the things he advocated. I would say that Congress, Republicans, Democrats, North, South, East, and West, liberals and conservatives will unite behind President Lyndon Johnson to adopt the basic measures of the past few years.
Are you suggesting that, as you say, it is ironic that it may be easier for legislation backed by Mr. Kennedy to go through because Mr. Kennedy has been killed?
No, I would say it won't be easier, but I think the sobering effect that this will have upon the country, the realization of what he was fighting for, a tribute to a president who believed, will all have their bearing upon the thinking of the Congress.
Would you of course were a member of Mr. Kennedy's cabinet for 2 years.
Yes, sir.
Would you expect the present cabinet to continue in office for quite a while? I realize that is up to the
Yes, for the indefinite future. Keep in mind that President Johnson attended cabinet meetings. He was at that table. He knew these men. I think that President Kennedy brought to the cabinet outstanding men of character and ability who Lyndon Johnson had worked with over the past 3 years, too. I feel that, and I know that Lyndon Johnson respects all of them, likes all of them. These men have worked with Lyndon Johnson and can work with Lyndon Johnson. And I would predict that the president would keep these men in the days ahead.
Senator Ribicoff, you have known Lyndon Johnson for a long time. You've known Mr. Johnson for a long time. And in the last roughly 2 years, of course, when you have been in the Senate, he has been, as Vice President, President of the Senate, and you've had a chance to get to know him even better. What would you say to us about President Johnson?
Well, President Johnson is a man of great experience. No man in the history of the United States has come to the presidency through the vice presidency as well equipped as Lyndon Johnson. If you look back at the whole perspective of American history, his knowledge of government, his knowledge of issues, both domestic and foreign, put him in a position of being able to assume leadership and assume it fast. I would say that Lyndon Johnson is a man of strong personality and strong character. The country will appreciate and the country will love Lyndon Johnson. He's altogether a different personality than John F. Kennedy. No matter how you look at both of those men, there are no basic similarities. But yet this nation has shown that it can take dissimilar men as leaders. President Roosevelt was a different personality than President Truman. Yet when President Truman came to the White House, he acquitted himself well and nobly, and history will show that he was one of our greatest presidents who handled the grave issues of his day successfully.
You think that Congress will in general be cooperative with Mr. Johnson?
Yes, I do believe so. I've had an opportunity to talk to a number of senators, Republican and Democratic, from different shades of thought, and you gather from their mood that there is a deep desire to cooperate with Lyndon Johnson in this time of national trouble and grief.
Senator, we speak a good deal about cooperation and unity. It finally expresses itself in concrete issues such as civil rights bill, to choose only one. Do you think that this feeling that we all have, that we must all pull together, will actually be translated into concrete legislative acts?
Yes, well, I would say this. I am confident that this Congress would have passed a strong civil rights bill. I am confident that it will do so under President Johnson, too. I would predict that before Congress goes home and finishes this session, it will have a good, strong, solid civil rights program.
Senator, there has been a proposal by Representative James Roosevelt of California, in which he has been joined by Representative Claude Pepper of Florida, for a memorial to President Kennedy, that would take the form of the award, posthumous award of the Congressional Medal of Honor to Mr. Kennedy. Do you expect some sort of memorial to the President?
I would say that would be the least that can be done. Undoubtedly, President Kennedy, for what he was, will be memorialized by the people of the United States. Keep in mind, this usually takes a little time. We don't have a Roosevelt memorial yet. But I am confident that the people of this nation who love President Kennedy for his personality and his works will join together in an expression to keep a memorial permanently in this nation's capital and in the hearts of his countrymen.
Jim Hurlbut in New York, perhaps there is a question you want to put to Senator Ribicoff before he leaves.
Well, thank you, Evan. You mentioned how effectively Senator Ribicoff worked to secure his party's nomination for President Kennedy at the convention in Los Angeles in 1960. And I, of course, covered the Connecticut delegation there on the floor for radio. And, Senator, do you feel that your efforts on the floor were well rewarded?
I think you did not hear the first part of the question. Jim Hurlbut said you worked very hard and very effectively in obtaining the presidential nomination for President Kennedy, or Senator Kennedy as he then was, in 1960. And you succeeded, you and the other people who were key figures in the Kennedy campaign for the nominations. What Jim Hurlbut asked was whether you feel that your efforts to secure the nomination for Mr. Kennedy were well rewarded.
Yes, I did. I think that President Kennedy brought to this nation an intelligence, a change of direction, a style, and a dedication that no other man could have brought who had been nominated at that time. It makes your heart cry out when you realize that if he had not received this nomination, that he would still have been alive. However, knowing John F. Kennedy, that would not have made a difference. John F. Kennedy was a type of a man that felt that he had an obligation to serve his nation. He felt that he would be a good president. He was confident that he would be a good president. He was a good president. And I think history will show that the accomplishments of John F. Kennedy were definitely worthwhile. And I think those of us who worked so hard on his behalf in Los Angeles in 1960 and the years before that feel that we made a small contribution towards bringing a great man to the White House.
Thank you very much, Senator Ribicoff. Jim, did you have another question for the Senator? I think he is in something of a hurry. He has other things to do, of course.
I'm sure he is, Ed, and I want to thank you and Senator Abraham Ribicoff for that fine report. And we'll be back with more after this announcement.
Tomorrow night, Sunday, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, NBC Radio will present a special memorial program entitled The Highest Price, a 4-hour documentary of the life and times of our late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and an evaluation of the impact on history of his life and death. The Highest Price, tomorrow night, Sunday, at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the NBC Radio Network.
We were talking about the 1960 Democratic nominating convention in Los Angeles, talking about the work of Senator Abraham Ribicoff, then Governor Ribicoff, and of Orville Freeman, and other people who were effective in securing the nomination of the party for President Kennedy and in making Lyndon Johnson the vice presidential nominee, a man who worked very hard at that 1960 convention, a man who has worked very hard over a long period of years in covering the great news of our nation, is a man who's been very close to this story ever since it broke more than 24 hours ago. A longtime friend and colleague of mine, Morgan Beatty. And I'd like to ask Morgan to come in and kind of assess the story up to this point.
Well, Jim, I've been out on a little legwork today while you fellows have been doing the working, and I think I've come up with the first hints of what the federal investigation of this shooting had brought in. Federal investigative authorities have made positive progress that leads me to report on unchallengeable authority. The case against the killer of the president, whoever he is, will be complete, conclusive, and will be free of miscalculation. These federal authorities are now mid-stride of an examination of the assassin's rifle, the one he was believed to have used. It's a foreign-made weapon, reportedly of Italian origin. They also have the bullets that struck both the president and Governor John Connally of Texas. There can be no mistake when final reports are in. The ballistics will prove conclusively whether or not the rifle found on the 6th floor of a Dallas warehouse building was the one that fired the fatal shots at President Kennedy. That, of course, is the supposition now. It also, presumably, would be the rifle that fired the wounding shots at Governor John Connally of Texas. The federal authorities are also certain that their evidence will be conclusive concerning the bullet cases, the shells found at the warehouse scene. Hundreds of federal agents from several divisions of the government security organizations are buttoning up every minute detail concerning the weapons, the bullets, the bullet cases, along with latent fingerprints, palm prints, and other evidence. They have progressed far enough at this time also to know exactly where the rifle found in the warehouse originated. It was bought at an American mail-order house. Federal authorities are now certain they will be able, without a shadow of a doubt, to trace that rifle and every person who handled it through the warehouse to the moment it was found after the assassination of President Kennedy into another warehouse in Dallas, Texas. The unbuttoned part of the case, to use the police language that you and I know so well, Jim, prevents any formal statements at this time. There are reasons for this. Every federal security agency involved in the case has strict orders from the very top of our government to be certain of every fact they find, to be certain that there will be no miscarriage of justice based on investigative error. For that reason, all heads of security agencies have orders, and subordinates have those orders to give no detail to the public until that detail has been checked, double-checked, and proven beyond peradventure of a doubt. All investigative agencies of the government have been ordered to be certain that no statement they might make at this time would stain the nation's reputation for justice in the courts or would destroy or infringe any citizen's civil rights. This means there must be no publication that would lead any judge to rule at any time that pre-publication had prejudiced justice.
Morgan, I notice as a good reporter, you have mentioned only the physical evidence that has been developed. You have not attempted in any way to prejudge anyone in this case. Do you feel that up to this time there has been such a public outcry against any individual that might militate against his getting a fair trial?
No, not at all up to this time, and furthermore, there's no evidence among federal authorities that any statements made by the Dallas authorities are incorrect. That isn't the point. I think, Jim, we might call attention to the listener, something most listeners probably don't know. There is no federal statute against murder except on federal territory. Now, this is a plain case of murder. It doesn't matter that the man, so far as the law is concerned, was the President of the United States. So that it is a state crime, a Texas state crime that was committed. Federal authorities may cooperate only in the areas that go beyond the state of Texas. Now, the mail-order house goes beyond the state of Texas. Those bullets go beyond the state of Texas. The gun goes beyond the state of Texas. So we must recollect that no federal agency would be justified in intervening in this case in any way that would damage a trial in the state of Texas. It would be doubly tragic. In case of murder, it doesn't matter that the man, so far as the law is concerned, was the President of the United States. In case of murder, it doesn't matter that the man, so far as the law is concerned, was the President of the United States. So that it is a state crime, a Texas state crime that was committed. Federal authorities may cooperate only in the areas that go beyond the state of Texas. Now, the mail-order house goes beyond the state of Texas. Those bullets go beyond the state of Texas. The gun goes beyond the state of Texas. So we must recollect that no federal agency would be justified in intervening in this case in any way that would damage a trial in the state of Texas. It would be doubly tragic, should the man be guilty, to have a court necessarily rule that this man had been tried, say, in the press or on the radio or on TV, and he could not get a fair trial in the court. Now we'd be in a fine fix, wouldn't we?
But Morgan, even beyond this trial of one man, the federal agencies will leave nothing undone in trying to determine the extent of any plot that might exist beyond the tortured mind of one man. Is that correct?
That is not only correct, but I'm sorry I'm unable to reveal all of my investigative approach to that subject with federal authorities. I think we might point something out in another case, however, that might be applicable here, or some people might want to think about. It was a young fellow by the name of Vincent Lee. You may recall that was rejected by the French Communist Party some years ago. He was, I believe, either taken into custody in New York for throwing ink on a business building here or in some business offices here in New York, and later he disappeared in Cuba. I'd like to point out that case was the case of a man who had been completely and thoroughly rejected by communist parties in the United States and in France and in Russia. I believe their conclusion was that he was totally unreliable as a member of the party. Now, that meant that the communist conspiracy could not be at all connected with this man's activities here or later when he went to Cuba. Now, we could have a similar situation here, although there's no proof of it. I will assure you that hundreds of federal agents are now investigating this phase of that case, and no stone will be left unturned to determine whether or not this is a conspiracy or a plot. Now, if you go a little deeper than that, you get into the question of how much a man's mind might be affected by what he has heard or read. In the case of this man, I believe his school teacher says that he was given to reading an awful lot of books, but he also made very low grades. I don't know that that's a clue at this time. Sometime it may be.
Morgan, going back 30 years to 1933, when Joseph Zangara was tried and convicted and executed for not the assassination of President Roosevelt, which he attempted to do, but for the assassination of Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak.
Well, now, nobody knows that more intimately than you do, because you covered it.
Not very much of it, Morgan, but he, too, was tried by the local authorities, was he not? Zangara was tried by the authorities in Dade County.
He had to be, because it was an attempted murder. And there is no federal charge of that type that is possible to launch against a man.
But do you remember at that time that Zangara was identified as a radical? People tried to say that it was a left-wing plot, and apparently no left-wing plot developed out of that either, did it?
No, the only common denominator in every single murder of a president or attempted murder in this country, every single one, the only one word that you can connect with those murders or attempts at murder is anarchy. It is quite true that every attempt on the life of a president was made through anarchy. Well, now you'd better go look up the definition legally of anarchy to recognize that many political persuasions use anarchistic techniques in the execution of what they call or believe to be their legal or moral obligations. So we have a very dim area there to be worried about.
Morgan, it seems interesting, and I know you as a Lincoln scholar and Civil War scholar are thoroughly familiar with this. Although we have a great national grief at this time, we don't have the state of hysteria that existed in this nation at the time of President Lincoln's assassination.
We can certainly thank God for that.
That is right. True. Because in the wake of that assassination of President Lincoln and the trial of Mrs. Surratt and Dr. Mudd and others who were involved in the case, there were some injustices done, apparently, in the wake of...
Unquestionably injustices done. As you will recall, in the case of Mary Surratt, this country was not at war at the time, and yet the Secretary of War of that time, Stanton, put this woman on trial before a military court. That in itself was clearly, under our law, a crime. This woman had nothing to do with that murder, and it was later proven that all that she had to do was that it was in her house that the plot was hatched. John Wilkes Booth had nothing to do with her, and she had nothing to do with him that pertained to the murder of Lincoln. Incidentally, this is the crime of murder that was committed on federal territory, and therefore was a case for federal courts. Lincoln was shot in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. But again, the hysteria. And unfortunately, there were religious overtones on both sides in the hysteria concerning the shooting of Lincoln. That was a blot on the record of this country. And you may be sure that every federal authority involved in this one knows that our record for justice was stained in the trial of Mary Surratt for the murder of Abraham Lincoln.
Morgan, it seems to me that one factor that must be involved in the lack of hysteria that exists at this time is the fact that our communications have so vastly improved over 100 years ago. That at that time, people were completely bewildered and puzzled, were not filled in on all the details of the plot against Mr. Lincoln, and this is what caused a great deal of the hysteria that existed then. But now, because of our modern communications, almost every person in the United States, wherever he may be, knows exactly the full details of what has happened and what is being done. And this is a factor, I think, in the present situation, don't you?
I think so. I should point out that communications, of course, can be a double-edged weapon, politically, communism versus democracy and so on. But we believe, I think, you and I who use this very delicate mechanism, communications, I believe both of us recognize a very important fact that all persons of common sense, and shall we say, those who are not extremists either to the right or left or unbalanced mentally, do have a tendency to correct the imbalances that occur in our midst, and communications helps to do it.
Morgan, you've been busy on this particular phase of this story. Have you had time to look at it in the broad view and assess the total impact of this happening on the nation?
I hardly have. I would like to make one observation that the occasional recklessnesses that occur among our people, the occasional excesses that occur among those of, shall we say, very good hold on their feelings, slop over into the area of those among us who are not capable of handling their mental and emotional capacities. And I think this will have a very definite effect on the next presidential election in this manner. That many statements designed to get the attention of the public, statements that could be called reckless, and I don't think I need to cite many. You and I have heard so many of them before political conventions that we are sickened with the reckless type of statement. But I do believe that the recklessness that might have come in 1964 in the presidential campaign has definitely been dampened down. I hope to God it has been.
Morgan, I think that's a very sound observation, and I think that's one that we're going to come to be thinking about more and more as time goes on now and we get closer to the conventions in July of next year. We're talking about the communications that have kept us abreast of developments in this country, and we also have heard words from every capital practically of the world in the intervening time. We're going to be back with more of that after this message.
You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Now, a few minutes ago, in fact, quite a few minutes ago now, we were talking to Irving R. Levine in Rome. He gave us a report on the developments in the Vatican City and in all of Italy up to that time. We understand that Irving R. Levine is standing by in Rome. We may be able to get a further report from the capital in Italy in just a moment. I understand now that Irving R. Levine is standing by, so let's switch to Irving R. Levine in Rome.
A small town in southern Italy has decided to name a street after President Kennedy. The Municipal Council of Gallipoli voted to do so today. This was just one act in the demonstration of national mourning taking place in Italy. On Monday, at the same time as the funeral takes place in Washington, a Mass will be celebrated in Rome's Cathedral, St. John in Lateran, sponsored by the Italian government and the American Embassy. Francis Cardinal Spellman of New York, will officiate. Cardinal Spellman also celebrated a massive requiem this evening in the American Catholic Church in Rome. This small church of Santa Susana was crowded with American residents and tourists, bishops from the United States who are attending the Ecumenical Council, and Italian representatives. The Italian state radio and television networks have canceled all programs and carry only solemn music. Americans are approached by Italian friends and even strangers with expressions of sympathy. Newspaper editorials eulogize President Kennedy and express curiosity about Lyndon Johnson. One newspaper states that the assassination has disillusioned many Europeans who thought America enjoyed a civilized political democracy where such outrages were impossible. Irving R. Levine, NBC News, Rome.
Thank you, Irving. As we all know, President Johnson has proclaimed Monday as a day of national mourning for President Kennedy. President Johnson ordered all federal offices in the nation closed on Monday, the day of the funeral services. And in paying tribute to Mr. Kennedy, President Johnson said, "A man of wisdom, strength, and peace. He molded and moved the power of our nation in the service of a world of growing liberty and order. All who love freedom will mourn his death." Former President Eisenhower, other dignitaries, close friends of the slain president, and members of his family have been filing past Mr. Kennedy's closed coffin at the White House today. The body will be moved to the Capitol building tomorrow to lie in state, transferred Monday morning to St. Matthew's Cathedral for services at noon. Among the dignitaries to attend the services will be President de Gaulle of France, Prince Philip of Britain, King Baudouin of the Belgians. White House News Secretary Pierre Salinger says it is not yet determined where Mr. Kennedy will be buried. Further details can be expected later today. We've been getting some reports on that from Washington. There is some indication that he'll be laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery. Attorney General Kennedy went out to look at Arlington National Cemetery earlier today. It is, however, still possible that he may be laid to rest in the family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts. The White House says a horse-drawn caisson, preceded by police and military escorts, will carry the body from the White House to the Capitol tomorrow.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And now we pause for station identification.
Wlw-Radio Cincinnati and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation ask that you join in a prayer for the consolation of the bereaved family of President Kennedy and for the guidance of President Johnson.
Former Ambassador Kennedy had been informed of the death of his son. For a report again on his reaction to that news, let's switch to Jim Jensen at Hyannisport.
Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, father of the late president, has taken the news of his son's untimely death remarkably well. That report we received just moments ago from the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. In fact, said our source, he's a real gutsy guy, meaning the ambassador. The source was not being disrespectful at all, but was certainly full of admiration. Because of the great length of time in which we did not hear anything about his reaction to the news, there was concern that possibly the 75-year-old ambassador was not reacting as well as some might have hoped. He's an invalid and has been in bad health for some time. But now this news out this evening that he has taken the news of his death, of his son's death, remarkably well. He was notified of this by Senator Edward Ted Kennedy at approximately 9:30 this morning. This was indicated at the compound itself by the matter of the flags. Heretofore, the flags had not been on the mast at all. But when the news had been given to Ambassador Kennedy, the flags were raised to full mast and then promptly dipped to half-mast, thus signifying that all knew of the late president's untimely death at the hands of an assassin. Our information tells us that all is very calm within inside the white picket fence surrounding the Kennedy compound. After church this morning, Eunice Shriver walked with her brother, Senator Ted Kennedy, along the V
Thank you, Jim Jensen. You've given us a little touch of the personal side of this great tragedy. There's more to it, too, from down in Washington, where a lonely little boy who observes his 3rd birthday on Monday wandered today through a big Washington house complaining, "I don't have anyone to play with." John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Jr. says his father was killed by a bad man, but still he doesn't seem to understand why the slain president is not there to walk the White House corridors with him, or why he's not allowed in the presidential offices. It's a little different for Caroline Kennedy, who's going to be 6 years old on Wednesday. She's bright beyond her years. She seems to comprehend death. The children were told last night that their father was dead. The White House didn't say who told them, but presumably it was their mother. Friends said Mrs. Kennedy, not given to public displays of emotion, was making it a point to try to hold up under the strain. They said she hasn't yet realized completely what has happened. She's kept a steady vigil with death since she saw her husband fatally wounded in his open car in downtown Dallas yesterday afternoon. She cradled him in her arms, his blood splattering over as she cried, "Oh, no." And Mrs. Kennedy kept a vigil outside the emergency room in Parkland Hospital in Dallas. And on the plane back to Washington, she remained transfixed, staring at the casket in an alcove. She declined to be comforted by those who wanted her to lie down and rest. Those who wanted to sponge her face were turned away gently with, "Thanks, I'm fine." This 34-year-old widow kept her children by her side today. She took them to the East Room, where the Reverend John J. Kavanaugh, former president of the University of Notre Dame, said Mass at 10:30 this morning. The children saw the closed bronze casket flanked by the flickering tall silver candlesticks. At Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the body lay during the night, Mrs. Kennedy was comforted by her obstetrician, Dr. John W. Walsh, a close personal friend who gave her a mild sedation to help her sleep for a while. The president's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, went to the hospital with her. When she saw her husband's body for the last time, Mrs. Kennedy placed her wedding ring on the finger of the man she alternately called Jack and the president, and she kissed him. After attending the private White House services, Mrs. Kennedy went back to the family quarters. President and Mrs. Johnson came up to see her today, as did former President Harry Truman and some others. The late president used to take a break from the strains of office by walking across the lawn to where his children were playing. They'd run to hug their father, and when he went home at night, he would clap his hands saying, "Where are my rascals?" The children came running. Now they're alone in the White House. And down in Dallas, where this story started, we have another report coming up from Tom Pettit of NBC News, who's been very close to this phase of the story ever since it started to develop. And let's switch now to Tom Pettit in Dallas.
The Dallas Times-Herald is out with a front-page editorial entitled, "Let Us Search Our Hearts." I thought I would read it to you. Terrible history has been made in Dallas, says the newspaper, and the magnitude of our city's sorrow can be measured against the enormity of the deed. John F. Kennedy, President of the United States of America, is dead, killed in Dallas. No matter what the explanation of the act, the awful reality of it overwhelms us. He died here. We do not know now, we may never know, why it happened in Dallas. And it is no comfort to our grief that an insane chance, operating with blind destiny, brought our president's death to us. But this we know, that as a city we must show the world the deep unity of our grief, the depths of the stunned void that is in each of us. Let us go into the open churches, the cathedrals, the synagogues, and there let us pray to God to teach us love and forgiveness. In the quiet of our homes, let us search our hearts, and through the terrible cleansing power of our grief, remove any vestiges of bitterness and hate. What happened here could have happened in any city, but first there had to be the seeds of hate, and we must pray that Dallas can never supply the atmosphere for tragedy to grow again. The bullet that felled our president was molded in an unstable world, but to our great sorrow, it found its mark here. So says the Dallas Times-Herald in a front-page editorial, and the mayor of Dallas has declared tomorrow a day of prayer. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News, reporting from Dallas.
Thank you, Tom. And now let's go back to Washington. Let's switch to Edwin Newman in Washington.
We heard a report a short time ago from Hyannisport that Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, the president's father, had been told of his son's death and had taken it well. From Boston, we learn that the president's grandmother, Mrs. John A. Fitzgerald, who is 98, does not yet know that her grandson is dead. Her son does plan to tell her, but he hasn't decided yet when. Her son is now in Washington and obviously will not tell her until he returns to Boston. She had a 98th birthday, Mrs. Fitzgerald did, 3 weeks ago, and President and Mrs. Kennedy sent her a bouquet. More information on those who are coming to the funeral service. President de Gaulle of France will arrive at 5 p.m. tomorrow here in Washington, Dulles Airport. The Foreign Minister of Israel, Mrs. Golda Meir, is arriving at Washington National Airport very early on Monday morning, just after midnight Sunday. Norway is sending the Crown Prince Harald, and its Prime Minister, Einar Gerhardsen. They are arriving tomorrow afternoon. Turkey is sending its Prime Minister, İsmet İnönü, and its Foreign Affairs Minister, Feridun Erkin. They are arriving Sunday night. İsmet İnönü is one of the great elder statesmen of his part of the world. He goes back to the days of the great Ataturk, whose lieutenant he was. He will be one of the oldest men attending the funeral service. With me in the studio now is a veteran and very well-known NBC News correspondent, Richard Harkness. Richard Harkness was covering a Republican meeting in St. Louis when news came of the assassination of the president. Dick, would you describe that scene?
Well, it's a very strange scene with hindsight, Ed. The Republicans have been having a series of regional conferences across the country. I covered 2 weeks ago the Southern Republican Conference at Charleston, South Carolina, and then flew out to St. Louis on Thursday to cover the Republican Midwestern Conference. The idea is, briefly, the states in one region got together. The national chairman, Mr. William Miller, member of Congress, goes out. The chairman of the congressional and senatorial campaign committees, and the state committee chairman, the committeemen, the fundraisers, the young Republicans talk precinct organization, how to raise money, looking forward to the 64 campaign. It's an organizational session, pure and simple. This happened to be Friday. Friday morning, the Midwest Republicans had met. They'd been addressed by Mr. Miller. They were working...
Mr. Miller being the Republican National Chairman.
Yes, Bill Miller of New York, the chairman. They were planning on how to defeat President Kennedy in his race for re-election next year. The issues that they would use against him. How they would beef up their precinct organization to get out an anti-Kennedy vote. And they were playing the politics and planning the politics right up to the hilt Friday morning. There in St. Louis, they recessed about 12:30 p.m. Friday for lunch. Had lunch together as a group. While they were eating there, the word came that President Kennedy had been shot. Then the word that President Kennedy was dead. And tears welled from the eyes of the women, welled in the eyes of the men, and coursed down their cheeks. And it struck me with hindsight that this was an exhibition, a demonstration, unplanned completely, in effect, of one of the strengths of our country. The opposition party working to oust Mr. Kennedy from the White House. But the minute that something news like that, realizing that this man was our president, they honored and respected him, and there was this genuine show of sadness over his death.
Dick, you covered the death of another president, Franklin Roosevelt.
Yes.
In 1945,
April.
18 and a half years ago.
That's right.
Does this remind you of that one?
Would you certainly in your mind compare the scene of then and the scene now? As you recall, Mr. Roosevelt had died at Warm Springs, Georgia, the beloved resort where he went so often to have his poliomyelitis treated. how he suffered a massive heart attack very suddenly as he was posing for his picture. Then I was at the Union Station here in Washington, Ed, when his body was brought back to the Capitol. In one very real sense, there was an important difference. Mr. Roosevelt died a natural death. Mr. Kennedy was assassinated. But Mr. Roosevelt was in his fourth term. I think that Washington and the country had come to look upon him as an institution, perhaps indestructible. And he was mortal. I think in that sense that Washington and the country was as stunned, was as shocked and as bereaved as the country is today over Mr. Kennedy's assassination. Mr. Roosevelt, of course, had been in office much longer, so he was better known. He had originated and administered relief programs which literally fed people during the Depression. There was a sense of personal bond between the people and Mr. Roosevelt, which I think that Mr. Kennedy had not had time to establish. Whether he would or not, something we'll never know. So there was that. Driving down Constitution Avenue, following the hearse that took Mr. Roosevelt's body to the White House, there were drawn faces. Faces of people here, even in Washington, who probably had never seen Mr. Roosevelt, had lost a personal friend. And I must say, watching television last night and seeing the faces of people in Dallas outside Mr. Kennedy's hospital, that there was the same kind of grief on their face that I saw in 1945 on the face of the people watching the hearse with the late and beloved FDR. I think, too, that there was one other difference. Lyndon Johnson had served much longer in Congress and in the Senate than had then Vice President Truman. Lyndon Johnson, as majority leader, was in more authority than Mr. Truman. Mr. Truman's main claim to fame up until the time he became vice president, just a short time before the Roosevelt death, the war investigation. I think now that the people know Lyndon Johnson, understand Lyndon Johnson better than they did Harry S. Truman. And in that sense, that there's a feeling more of the continuity of government, that the country will feel more at home with, know more what to expect from President Johnson than it did from President Truman, who really was new and had not been as well known in Washington. But in many ways, I think that the feeling in the Capitol is much the same that April period 18 years ago as it is today. Ed.
Jim Hurlbut, I'd like to ask Dick Harkness some further questions unless you want to cut in.
Why don't you keep it there then, Ed, for the next couple of minutes? I'm interested very much in what Dick has to say, and I'm sure everyone is.
Thank you, Jim. Dick, at St. Louis, you were at the Republican Midwest Conference. You saw Republican politicians who had been talking about how to defeat President Kennedy next year, weeping at the news of his death.
Yes.
Do you think that the national unity we are now hearing we must have in these times, and for which President Johnson will ask when he speaks to the Congress either on Wednesday or Friday, will actually come about?
I don't know, Ed. I'm not sure. I heard Senator Rivikoff and his feeling, expressed the feeling that it would. I am not sure what national unity means. I think that the Republicans will hold a position, and that President Johnson will follow the Kennedy position.
Well, let us say this, that national unity would not necessarily mean that the Republicans had to abandon their position.
Yes, that's what I
accept
the
the
point
Democratic position.
That's the point I wanted to take.
I think the point you're making, and there's no point, it's silly for me to try to make it for you, is that national unity has to be something specific and concrete on a specific and concrete issue.
That's right. So many times a politician, and I don't mean to use this as I know Lyndon Johnson did today, he wants national unity, which means agreeing with him. And I think the Republicans, of course, will go as far with Lyndon Johnson as they can. The Senate Majority Leader Everett Dirksen really has given a great deal of cooperation to Mr. Kennedy. I'm sure he'll give Lyndon Johnson no less.
Might very well give him as much or more, since he has worked so closely with Lyndon Johnson when he was the leader on one side and Johnson on the other.
Sat across the aisle from each other, and I've heard Lyndon Johnson say time and time again the high respect that he had for Everett Dirksen. While they would differ, he'd always say, you can always trust Ev Dirksen's word.
There is this point, is there not, Dick, that if we are talking about unity in legislative terms, that the unity is more lacking within the Democratic Party on many issues than it is between the Democratic and Republican
parties.
That's
a very fair assessment, and as you know, I've been out at Andrews Air Force Base over in Maryland this afternoon, meeting governors as they came in for this unhappy weekend, and Governor Ross Barnett came in. I must say that Governor Barnett was more praiseworthy of Mr. Kennedy today than he was when Mr. Kennedy was alive. And I said, what do you think will there be a new relationship between the South and the Johnson administration? And he told about the high regard he had for Lyndon Johnson, but he also said Southerners hold strong beliefs and will continue to stay by their beliefs.
You know, may I interrupt for a moment, Ed? I'm sorry to interrupt, Ed. I think that while we've been talking about this reaction to President Johnson, I think his first official action today in announcing an official proclamation making Monday a day of mourning for President Kennedy had a great deal of impact on the public. We heard that announcement earlier. We also recorded it. I think we ought to hear it again now.
To the people of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, has been taken from us by an act which outrages decent men everywhere. He upheld the faith of our fathers, which is freedom for all men. He broadened the frontiers of that faith, and he backed it with the energy and the courage which are the mark of the nation that he led. A man of wisdom, strength, and peace, he molded and moved the power of our nation in the service of a world of growing liberty and order. All who love freedom will mourn his death. As he did not shrink from his responsibilities, but welcome them, so he would have us not shrink from carrying on his work beyond this hour of national tragedy. He said it himself. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. Now, therefore, I, Lyndon B. Johnson, President of the United States of America, do appoint Monday next, November 25, the day of the funeral service of President Kennedy, to be a national day of mourning throughout the United States. I earnestly recommend the people to assemble on that day in their respective places of divine worship, there to bow down in submission to the will of Almighty God, and to pay their homage of love and reverence to the memory of a great and good man. I invite the people of the world who share our grief to join us in this day of mourning and rededication. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States of America to be affixed. Done at the city of Washington this, the 23rd day of November, in the year of our Lord, 1963, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 188th.
That was President Lyndon B. Johnson issuing his first official proclamation, making Monday a day of mourning. Jim Hurlbut, NBC News, New York.
You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
We'll rejoin NBC in just a moment for this continuous coverage. The Wlw Communications Exchange has been informed that all public and parochial schools in Hamilton County and also the Milford schools and the public offices in Claremont County, Ohio, will be closed Monday. Also, the public and parochial schools in the greater Cincinnati area located in northern Kentucky will be closed Monday. At this time, for an up-to-date report on the regional weather, we take you to our WLW radar weather service and meteorologist Frank Pierce. Frank?
Good evening, everyone. Temperature in downtown Cincinnati stands at 34 degrees now. Cloudiness is spread over the area. The humidity, though drying, is still a little bit high, 86%, but drying and some clearing from the west. The barometer continues to rise very rapidly as the center of the mound of colder air continues to move toward our particular area of the Ohio Valley. This cold Arctic air, of course, continues under northerly winds to press colder and colder temperatures right on down across the Great Lakes area into this particular region, and the leading edge of it is now breaking east of the Appalachian Mountains and is just now moving into the Washington, D.C. area. Winds there have turned from rather strong southerly winds to westerly winds now. The rain is once again on the heavy side, and the current temperature has dropped 4 degrees to 59 degrees. Back here, of course, deeper in the cold air, we have such temperatures as 34 at Cincinnati and Dayton, Ohio, and also Marion, 35 at Columbus, and Lima 38 degrees, all under cloudy skies. Portsmouth also cloudy and 43. Louisville now breaking out of the cloudiness a little bit with a temperature of 40. And Lexington still cloudy and 37. Indianapolis, Indiana is showing some signs of clearing now, but they're down to a freezing temperature of 32. It's 33 at Richmond, and Muncie is now 34. And our WLW weather forecast, with the cold air to stay with us for the rest of the weekend, is one of a little colder variety than we've seen in some time. Clearing skies into the early morning hours, cold and a little bit less windy during the night tonight, but that wind will increase again tomorrow, incidentally. We'll look for the early morning lows to be in the 20s and lowest 30s. Here in Cincinnati, about 24 degrees for the cold early morning temperature. Then during the day on Sunday, generally fair to occasionally partly cloudy skies, not completely clear, that is, so we'll be windy and cold throughout the day, with the temperatures mostly in the 30s and around 35 to possibly 37 here in the city for tomorrow's high temperature. The outlook for Monday means that we can look for not quite so cold weather. That'll start Sunday night as we get warming from the midsections of the country, where it's just now beginning, but along with this, increasing cloudiness, and that could bring a chance of rain to the northern side of Ohio and northern Indiana late Monday or Monday night. The Cincinnati temperature then again, 34 degrees, down to 24 tonight, and up to 35 or 37 tomorrow, with windy conditions across the area again on Sunday. That's the weather, and back to Jim.
In addition to the Hamilton County and the Milford schools in Claremont County, Ohio, and the public offices in Claremont County being closed Monday, in Indiana, all schools in Ripley County, including city schools, all city and county schools of Franklin County, Indiana, Ohio County, and Rising Sun schools, also the Lawrenceburg and Aurora, and all Dearborn County schools in Indiana will be closed Monday. We return you now for continuous coverage on the death of our President, John F. Kennedy, to NBC.
Now back to Jim Hurlbut in New York.
Thank you, Edwin Newman. I think that all of us in our business, too, will begin to know Lyndon Johnson now even better than we've known him up to this time. We will see emerging, I think, a new Lyndon Johnson as he takes over the responsibilities of the presidency and moves ahead in executing the high responsibilities of this office. This is Jim Hurlbut, NBC News, New York.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And now we pause for station identification.
This is the nation station, WLW, in Cincinnati.
A grieving nation and a sympathetic world have poured out a really never-ending stream of tributes today to President John F. Kennedy. We've heard a good many of them. From almost everywhere, and Red China was a lonely exception, came words of regret and grief and condolences for Mr. Kennedy's young widow. Messages of shared sorrow came, too, to the slain president's mother and father. It was not until today, as we've heard, that Joseph P. Kennedy, ill at the family home in Massachusetts, was told of the death of this son in whom he took such pride. But much of this story is still developing in our nation's capital. And let's switch now back to Edwin Newman in Washington.
There are developments at the White House, and we go to the NBC correspondents there.
Jim, is the net on now? Because I've got local on my... It's just been announced here officially that President Kennedy will be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. This because of the wishes of his family. Services will be held at graveside Monday afternoon after final rites here at St. Matthew's Roman Catholic Cathedral in Washington. The church will be filled with dignitaries and officials who have been invited to attend, heads of state and other persons, members of the immediate family as well. The dress for the funeral will be mourning gray coats and striped trousers. At the present time, Mrs. Kennedy is at the White House. Her sister, Lee Radziwill, has just arrived from London and is now consoling Mrs. Kennedy. Press Secretary Pierre Salinger has just given us additional names of dignitaries from abroad who will be in Washington for the funeral services. From Japan, the Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda will fly in from Tokyo, as will the Crown Prince Akihito. We have other additional lists here, and I will read them to you to give you the scope of the numbers of persons and their status who will be attending the funeral services for the President. From Canada, the Prime Minister Lester Pearson. From West Germany, in addition to Chancellor Ludwig Erhard, the President of the Federal Republic, Heinrich Lübke, in addition to the Foreign Minister, Gerhard Schroeder, and the Defense Minister, Kai-Uwe van Hassel. King Baudouin of Belgium will also be in attendance. I believe we gave that to you earlier. Ireland's Foreign Minister, Frank Aiken. The Prime Minister of Vietnam, Nguyen Ngoc Tho. From Jamaica, the Prime Minister, Sir Alex Bustamante. From Canada, as I mentioned, Prime Minister Lester Pearson. From Morocco, the Foreign Minister, Ahmed Gudira. From Liberia, the Secretary of State, Rudolph Grimes. From Tanganyika, the Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Chief Erasto A.M. Mangenia. From Algeria, the Minister of State, Amar Ouzagane. From Tunisia, the Foreign Minister, Mongi Slem. The Vice President of Spain, Munoz Grandi. From Nicaragua, the Director of the Foreign Relations Division, Alfonso Ortega Urbana. In addition to General de Gaulle from France, General Ayré, the Chief of the French Joint Chiefs of Staff, will also be in Washington for the final services. From Portugal, the President of the Cooperative Chamber, Luis Supico Pinto. From Poland, the Deputy Chief of the Council of State, Stanislas Kurczynski, and the Deputy Chairman of the Council of Ministry, Piotr Yaroshevich. From the Soviet Union, in addition to Anastas Mikoyan, who has already been announced as heading the Soviet delegation, Mikhail Smirnovsky, the Chief of the American Countries Division of the Soviet Foreign Ministry. From Romania, the Deputy Foreign Minister and the Chief United Nations Representative, Mr. Melita. And from the Netherlands, Crown Princess Beatrix will represent her nation here in addition to the Foreign Minister, Joseph Luntz. And from Great Britain, in addition to Prince Philip and Sir Alec Douglas Hume, the Prime Minister, the head of the Labour Party, Harold Wilson, will also be in Washington. Prince Philip, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, and Mr. Wilson will be arriving at Dulles International Airport tomorrow night. From Luxembourg, Prince Jean, the hereditary Grand Duke, and the Foreign Minister of Luxembourg, Eugene Charles. From Jordan, the Foreign Minister, Anton Atala. From Congo, Leopoldville, the Vice President, Monsongo. And to repeat earlier what we told you, President Kennedy will be buried at Arlington National Cemetery Monday afternoon. This is the wish of the Kennedy family. Mrs. Kennedy, to repeat, is now at the White House. She is being consoled at the moment by her sister, Lee Radziwill, who has just arrived from London. President Johnson is across the street. He was as of a few minutes ago, where he was meeting with former President Truman. This is Robert Goralski, NBC News at the White House.
Jim, that is as much as we know to this moment. Here in Washington, Robert Goralski has given us all the up-to-date information, and as we had reported earlier, Mr. Kennedy is to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, just across the Potomac from Washington, within sight, incidentally, of the mansion of Robert E. Lee.
Well, earlier, Edwin, President Johnson proclaimed Monday an official day of mourning, and I note that already this is being implemented officially. Controller James J. Saxon gave his approval today to the closing of banks on Monday, the National Day of Mourning for President Kennedy, and he urged all of them to take that action where the local law allows it. He said it is the presumption of this office that all national banks will appropriately observe the clear non-business implications of the President's proclamation by the adoption of suitable action. In several states, the governors or other state authorities have already acted to authorize banks to close, and similar action may soon be expected in other states. We're advised that banks or groups of banks in other states have already determined to remain closed for all or part of Monday. And he said this office strongly approves the action so far taken and urges the adoption of similar action in the remaining states where authorized by local law or practice. And Ed, we reported earlier that the schools in New York City will be closed, and I'm sure that this will be reflected all across the country. I don't think there'll be very much business done anywhere in the United States on Monday, do you?
I don't, and I think we would all agree that that is as it should be. So that remarkable list of delegates, representatives from foreign lands who will attend the President's funeral, I'd like to add some names that we mentioned earlier, but perhaps it would be as well to mention them again. From Israel, the Foreign Minister, Mrs. Golda Meir. From Norway, Crown Prince Harald and Prime Minister Gerhardsen. From Turkey, the Prime Minister İsmet İnönü and the Foreign Affairs Minister Ferian Erkin. From Argentina, the Vice President, Dr. Carlos H. Perete, the Foreign Minister, Dr. Miguel Ángel Zavala Ortiz, and the Secretary of War, General Ignacio Ábalos. So it will be a tremendous concourse of great and small people, ordinary people, dignified people, the great of the world, and most of the rest of us who have no particular distinction who will be here on Monday to say a last farewell to a president who was shot down.
Edwin, a thing I've been wondering about, as these chiefs of state come into the nation's capital, I presume that most of them will live at their own embassies in Washington while they're in the capital. Is that correct?
I would assume that would be the case. I suppose some of them will put up at hotels, but probably most of them at their embassies. It's a melancholy thought that there will be a tremendous security problem arising from their presence here. This is not the sort of thing that the security people could take in stride at any time, the presence of people like de Gaulle, for example. And in these circumstances, it will be something that the security people will have to pay additional attention to. Jim, I've just heard that there is more information available at the White House, and so here is Robert Goralski at the White House.
The White House has just announced that President Johnson will address a joint session of Congress on Wednesday at 12:30. It is expected that the President will not make a statement of program, but will appeal to the nation and to the joint houses for national unity and following the tragedy of the death of President Kennedy. It is understood that President Johnson will spend Tuesday conferring with foreign dignitaries who are coming to Washington to discuss the world situation and relations with the United States. He is also expected to spend much of the day reviewing major policy papers in preparation for his address to the joint session of Congress on Wednesday at 12:30. This is Richard Valeriani, NBC News at the White House.
Well, that is the information we had earlier, that President Johnson would speak to the joint session of Congress on Wednesday. We didn't know before that official announcement was made whether it would be on Wednesday or on Friday. It will not be a partisan speech. There will apparently be no reference to a legislative program. It will instead be a speech devoted to an appeal to the nation to hold together, come together in these times, and no doubt also an occasion for a tribute from the new president to the old. I think the proclamation that President Johnson read today, in which he proclaimed Monday a national day of mourning, itself showed what he thought of his predecessor. The language was simple, but in a very few words he managed to tell a great deal about what he thought of Mr. Kennedy. Well, we have everything lined up now, apparently as far as it's going to be. The funeral on Monday, the foreign dignitaries who are coming in for the funeral to see President Johnson on Tuesday, the joint session of Congress on Wednesday, Monday to be a day of national mourning, and tomorrow, Sunday, to be a day on which the public will be able to file past the casket in which President Kennedy lies. That is the program, Jim, as we have it to this moment.
Come, of course, right now, this is Jim Hurlbut, NBC News, New York.
Tomorrow night, Sunday, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, NBC Radio will present a special memorial program entitled The Highest Price, a 4-hour documentary on the life and times of our late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and also an evaluation of the impact on history of his life and death. The Highest Price, tomorrow night, Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the NBC Radio Network.
President Johnson stressed today that the Kennedy administration foreign policy will be continued and asked that all United States ambassadors around the world stay on their jobs. It was understood that the new president wanted Dean Rusk to remain as Secretary of State and that this was agreeable to Rusk. That was presumably discussed at that cabinet meeting this afternoon. High-ranking officials under Mr. Rusk also indicated that they intend to stay on. Mr. Rusk, as many of us saw, was the lead-off cabinet member on President Johnson's appointment list. Afterwards, informed sources said that the new chief executive made plain his interest in continuity of United States foreign policy. Meanwhile, a mounting number of foreign governments were planning to send top representatives to Mr. Kennedy's funeral on Monday, and by late today, some 30 nations had informed Washington one or more of their leaders would attend the ceremony. We've heard about that from Edwin Newman and from Robert Goralski. We've also heard congressional sources predicting today that President Johnson would adopt the Kennedy legislative program as his own and, as we said, vigorously press for its enactment at the session which starts next January. The office of the President of the United States, with all of its crowding decisions and pressures, ceremony and security, closed around President Johnson today. At 8:40 this morning, this tall Texas politician, who had been elevated to the presidency only 19 hours before by an assassin's bullet, left his home in a fashionable suburb of Washington. He was flanked by motorcycle outriders and followed by a Secret Service car as he sped to the White House. And from then until early this evening, he put in a day filled with intelligence briefings, with conferences with top officials on foreign and defense policy, a meeting with the full cabinet, as we've said, a talk with former President Eisenhower, a session with legislative leaders of both parties. He still had time, took time to visit the grief-stricken widow of John F. Kennedy, and an interlude of prayer in the old St. John's Episcopal Church across Lafayette Square from the White House. So it was a day of business tempered with consideration. The old Johnsonian habits, the affable carelessness of time had dropped from him. Precisely, he kept to his schedule, but he found time for these little acts of kindness. One official who was close to the new president said he was moving with the natural grace of the gentleman he is, but also with a sense of responsibility. Others said they detected at once a new strain of dignity, especially in President Johnson's awareness of the worldwide impact of his accession. Thus it was that Mr. Johnson, who insisted in meetings with the highest officials that he wished them all to remain at their jobs, while the officials themselves replied that this would do for a while only. Sooner or later, they told their new chief he must consider himself free to shape what was described as a Johnson administration responsive to his own ideas and habits and personality. Already today, we've seen that developing, but meanwhile, this story continues to grow in other parts of the nation. And for a different sort of report, for another report, let's switch to George Wood in San Antonio.
4 young airmen isolated from the world in a space cabin at Brooks Aerospace Medical Center at San Antonio, Texas, expressed disbelief and then grief upon hearing of the death of President Kennedy. The airmen from Michigan, Florida, and New York saw Mr. Kennedy in person less than 24 hours before he died. The president walked into the experimental area housing the cabin with Dr. Billy E. Welch, chief of the Environmental Systems Branch. Dr. Welch explained the use of the simulated flight. Then Mr. Kennedy, expressing his usual interest for space activities, asked if anything significant had been found to the detriment of the men. When told that nothing was amiss, Mr. Kennedy put on a headset and microphone, looked through a glass window, and asked the airmen, "How long have you been there, and how are things going?" When the men said all was well and they had been inside 11 days, Mr. Kennedy handed the headset to his wife. Jackie declined to put it on, but she stepped close to the window, crossed her fingers, and waved them in a good luck sign. Then the late president and his wife departed to join the motorcade and leave San Antonio. This is George Wood in San Antonio, reporting for NBC News.
Thank you, George Wood. A little while ago, we talked with Morgan Beatty about the job of investigation that's going on down in Dallas as federal and local law enforcement officials are weaving a tightening skein of evidence around Lee Harvey Oswald, the 24-year-old warehouse worker charged with assassinating President Kennedy yesterday. And while the defendant, under prolonged interrogation, continued to deny the crime, Dallas County District Attorney Henry Wade said this afternoon, "I think we have enough evidence to convict him now, but we anticipate a lot more evidence in the next few days." Morgan Beatty pointed out that since there is no federal law against murder except on federal ground, Oswald will be tried in Dallas County, and District Attorney Henry Wade will handle the prosecution. We talked about the implications of some of the statements that have been made, and one of the statements that was made down there was made by Captain Will Fritz, chief of the Dallas Police Homicide Bureau. He came out from this continuing questioning of Oswald and many other witnesses to say, "We're convinced beyond any doubt that he killed the president. I think the case is cinched." But District Attorney Wade said he planned to present the case to the grand jury next Wednesday, or at the latest the following Monday. The case might come to trial, he hazarded a guess on this, in mid-January. A major item of evidence cited by the prosecution at a news conference at police headquarters in Dallas was a statement to police by Oswald's Russian-born wife, Marina, who was questioned both last night and again this morning. Wade quoted her as saying that Oswald had a rifle similar in appearance to that used in the assassination in the garage of their home. He had it there last Thursday night, and it was not there after Oswald went to work yesterday morning at the book warehouse, whence came the shots that felled the president and Texas Governor John Connally. We've had a report, incidentally, on the condition of Governor John Connally. He is progressing satisfactorily in Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Going back to the investigation of the case, Police Chief Jesse Curry of Dallas quoted another unidentified witness as saying that when Oswald walked into the warehouse yesterday morning, he was carrying a long package wrapped in brown paper, which he told somebody was a window shade. and the fatal rifle was found near a sixth-floor window of the warehouse shortly after the crime. Other employees were quoted as stating that Oswald had stayed upstairs when they went out to watch the president go by. Ironically, a policeman in the warehouse stopped Oswald when he came into the building lunchroom carrying that brown paper-wrapped parcel under his arm. He actually pulled a revolver and pointed it at Oswald until a foreman said that Oswald worked in the building, and he let the man go. So, as we said, this weaving of the evidence against Lee Harvey Oswald continues. And around the nation, this story continues to develop. And let's turn now for a different phase of the story. Let's switch to Ken Kurtz at Charleston, West Virginia.
With the exception of Massachusetts, there is no state with which I am better acquainted or to which I am more indebted. Those were the words of President John Kennedy to the people of West Virginia. He meant them. He expressed that thought often, losing no opportunity to stress that it was his victory in the 1960 West Virginia primary which catapulted him into the White House. Kennedy's upset victory over Senator Humphrey in May of 1960 was viewed as proving that a Catholic could be elected president. November of 1960 confirmed that belief. Mr. Kennedy's first act as president was to double the food allotment for West Virginians on relief. The state had reason to thank him many times during his 3-year administration. When news of his death hit the Mountain State yesterday, it was greeted with utter disbelief, then shock, then grief. The Democratic governor kept asking his staff, but is he dead? Is he dead? The Republican mayor of the capital city was made ill by the news and had to go home. Students and teachers in some schools broke into tears. A few fainted. Many West Virginians felt a personal kinship to the president. In his 1960 campaign, thousands of mountaineers personally greeted the lanky young man with the strange accent, the ready smile, the unruly shock of hair. He became an old friend, or as one of our senators put it, they believed in Mr. Kennedy. On the occasion of our 100th birthday last June, Mr. Kennedy made his final public appearance in West Virginia. From the Capitol steps, the president made a short speech in a falling rain. As he looked out over the crowd, he began by saying, "The sun does not always shine in West Virginia, but the people do. The people of West Virginia are not shining today." Ken Kurtz in Charleston, West Virginia.
Thank you, Ken Kurtz. Earlier today, we had a report from Wlw-Radio and from the Soviet news agency TASS, in which they disclaimed any responsibility for Lee Harvey Oswald. We've had other reaction from that side of the Iron Curtain, this from Belgrade, Yugoslavia. The official newspaper Borba suggested today attempts were being made to, as they phrased it, poison the atmosphere by stressing that the man accused of murdering President Kennedy was married to a Russian and had lived in Russia. Borba says such tactics were reminiscent of the Nazi attempts to prove that the burning of the German Reichstag in 1933 was the work of communists. That's the report on the official newspaper Borba in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, a different point of view. Earlier today, Ambassador Adlai Stevenson provided NBC's Martin Agronsky with what I considered a deeply moving reminiscence of the workings of instinct and the classic unpredictability of fate. The UN ambassador recalled the ugly incident in Dallas a month ago when he'd been spat upon and reviled by hate-filled extremists. As he flew to Los Angeles later, the ambassador said he reflected on what had happened. He felt impelled to call the White House and to urge that President Kennedy reconsider his plan to visit Dallas some weeks later. Mr. Stevenson spoke by phone from Los Angeles to the president's advisor, Arthur Schlesinger. I told Schlesinger, he said, that I felt there was a mood of unpredictable madness in Dallas, and the instinct induced me to urge that the president cancel his visit to the city. Mr. Schlesinger said he would telephone he would tell the president. A few days later, Mr. Stevenson continued, I called Schlesinger again. I told him that after reflection, I wanted to withdraw my suggestion that the president's Dallas visit be canceled. I said that, of course, the political necessity of a Texas visit in the light of the forthcoming election would make it very difficult to change the Dallas plans. I said it would be too obvious a slap in the face to the people of the city. I look back now, Mr. Stevenson said, in talking to Martin Agronsky, and I am filled with sadness when I realize how right was my first instinct. The ambassador paused a moment, then he said, it's too bad that in my old age they couldn't have spent their violence on me and spared this young man for our nation's work. And a little while ago, we heard Tom Pettit down in Dallas talking about the reaction of the people of the city to this tragic incident in the city itself. And he questioned then whether the people of Dallas felt a sense of guilt because this action had taken place there. And people in Dallas wondered whether or not the rest of the nation would blame them for this act of violence that took the life of the president. Perhaps in some places it will be blamed on Dallas, in other places it will not. This story will begin to emerge as the hours go by. This is Jim Hurlbut, NBC News, New York.
For those local stations that might have some local news or public service announcements of local importance, we'll provide stations with approximately 4 minutes for this purpose at 5 minutes before the hour and half hour. The network will, however, continue coverage during this period. The following is the cutaway cue. You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
We've had some reports of sometimes unfortunate incidents in relation to the broadcasting of the story of the death of the president. For instance, in Britain, after broadcasting the news of Mr. Kennedy's death, the British Broadcasting Corporation put a comedy on television. There was a barrage of angry complaints that deluged BBC immediately, and the network went back to church music and tributes to Mr. Kennedy. As we know, Queen Elizabeth's husband, Prince Philip, will represent the British Crown at the funeral Monday. He will fly from London tomorrow with Prime Minister Sir Alec and Lady Douglas Hume. Queen Elizabeth said she was shocked and horrified by the tragedy. The Prime Minister was one of more than 5,000 who attended a requiem mass for Mr. Kennedy today at the Roman Catholic Cathedral of Westminster. Representing France at the funeral will be President Charles de Gaulle. Mr. de Gaulle said Mr. Kennedy died like a soldier under fire for his duty and in the service of his country. Another towering figure of World War II, General Douglas MacArthur, also struck the military theme. As a former comrade in arms, his death killed something in me, Mr. MacArthur said in his message to Mrs. Kennedy that was sent from here in New York City. A great statesman and a wise and valiant man was the tribute from Winston Churchill, who had listened in London to television accounts of the assassination. Former Presidents Herbert Hoover and Dwight Eisenhower gave their statements here in New York. Mr. Hoover said Mr. Kennedy has given his life for his country. And Mr. Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, said he shared with all Americans a feeling of shock and dismay. Former President Harry Truman in Independence, Missouri, said he was shocked beyond words. And as we heard Mr. Truman's words from Independence, it was very clear by his tone of voice that he was indeed shocked by this incident. Among Republican presidential possibilities, Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York has declared a 30-day mourning period for the state. Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona called the president's death a profound loss to the nation and to the free world. Richard M. Nixon, who ran against Mr. Kennedy in 1960, called his death a terrible tragedy. Former Vice President John Nance Garner was described as badly shaken by the news. Mr. Kennedy called former Vice President Garner down at Uvalde, Texas, just a few hours before he was killed, to congratulate him on his 95th birthday. Negro leaders across the nation compared the loss of Mr. Kennedy to the death of Abraham Lincoln, who was felled by an assassin in 1865. A. Philip Randolph said, "The second emancipator of black people from the serfdom of racial segregation has been struck down." And Roy Wilkins, Executive Secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, said the nation and the world, in Mr. Kennedy's death, had been deprived of a stalwart leadership in the ageless struggle for human advancement. Two Southern governors who fought Mr. Kennedy's proposals for Negroes, George Wallace of Alabama, Governor Ross Barnett of Mississippi, joined in deploring what Governor Barnett called the cowardly act. Wallace said the assassin must be filled with universal malice. In Dallas, as we reported, where the fatal shots were fired, the entire city was grieved and angry, too. Mayor Earl Cabell said that never before had the city welcomed any guest with the enthusiasm it showered on Mr. Kennedy. Yet, he said, everything had been tragically marred by the irrational act of one man. A Japanese who had a unique spot in Mr. Kennedy's career expressed regrets. This was Kohei Hanamai, who was captain of the destroyer that almost killed Mr. Kennedy in 1943 when it rammed his torpedo boat. The world has lost an irreplaceable man, Hanamai said. That's the reaction, some of the reaction to the death of President Kennedy. Jim Hurlbut, NBC News, New York.
The NBC Radio Network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We'll be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We'll begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We now pause for station identification.
This is the Nation Station, WLW in Cincinnati.
You know, I think all of us think of the late President Kennedy as a young man who was very much interested in sports of all variety. Not only interested in sports, but interested in physical fitness. We know about touch football, we know about 50-mile hikes, but there's a great deal more to the story of President Kennedy's interest in sports. Let's get some of that from Lou Boda.
Right, Jim. Well, the nation knows that the late chief executive was intensely interested in this area. He'd been present at All-Star games, the Army-Navy game, the World Series. He had his physical fitness program, which Bud Wilkinson institutes out of Washington. Today, in deference to the late chief executive, I counted perhaps 40 games which were canceled today. The Harvard-Yale game was canceled, may not be played ever. Some other games were rescheduled for Thanksgiving, some for the following weekend, which would push the college schedule back. There were a few games played today. For example, Kentucky Vanderbilt, that game was played. 35,000 who the crowd stood in a moment of silence, paying their last respects to the chief executive. However, there are a couple of basketball games tonight on the pro schedule. The American Football League is canceled, but the National Football League schedule will be on tomorrow. Games will be played. Commissioner Pete Rozelle said that sports have always been played in times of stress, and considering the fact that the late president was so intensely interested, that he thought the schedule should be played tomorrow, and the National Football League will play.
Lou, did you ever see any of the touch football games that Mr. Kennedy engaged in?
No, and as a matter of fact, Jim, I don't think there is any footage on this either, which was a well-kept family secret unto themselves, although they played perhaps at Hannahsport and perhaps at the White House. But this again was in the vein of their own little exclusive club there. We know he was interested. We know that he had been to several places and big events around the country. But the games today, this is the wind-up of the 1963 season. There were key games in the Big Ten. There were key games in the East. For instance, Princeton-Dartmouth game, which was canceled. There was key games in the West Coast to wrap up the Rose Bowl there. All these games are washed out, and most of them will be rescheduled.
Well, we'll see those games when they are rescheduled, Lou. This an official proclamation by President Johnson has had a lot of other sidebar effects that's been implemented by Comptroller Saxon, who has said that the banks will be closed, many of the banks will be closed. And now we have a report from Washington that there will be no postal deliveries on Monday, and post offices generally will be closed. And Mr. Johnson, as we said, has proclaimed Monday as a national day of mourning for the late president. Postmaster General John Gronowski announced the closing tonight, but he said he's authorized all postmasters to make available certain essential mail services to meet urgent community needs. In such cases, limited window service will be provided for business mailers. No postal services will be available between 12 noon and 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Incoming mail will be delivered to post office boxes, and special delivery mail will be delivered. We've had a report from Lou Boda on the sports aspects of this story. We had this report on the closing of the postal deliveries, post offices, but there's more in Washington, and let's switch now to Peter Hackus in Washington.
Well, Jim, the first item is an announcement by White House News Secretary Pierre Salinger
that Mrs. Rose Kennedy, the mother of the late president, accompanied by her son, Senator Edward Kennedy, will fly here to Washington tomorrow afternoon. The late president's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, will not attend the funeral. Among the heads of state who will be arriving tomorrow, French President Charles de Gaulle, a rather significant visitor to this country at this moment. He arrives at 3:30 p.m. at Dulles Airport, just outside Washington. British Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas Hume arrives at 8:45 p.m. These are all Washington times, also at Washington's Dulles Airport. Berlin's Mayor Willy Brandt arrives at 8:30 p.m. This is tomorrow evening at National Airport here in Washington. West German Foreign Minister Kai-Uwe von Hassel arrives tomorrow morning here in Washington at the National Airport, probably to be accompanied by West German Chancellor Ludwig Erhard. You may recall both these gentlemen and several other West German officials had been scheduled to make an appearance in this country just a little bit later. Apparently they're moving up their visit to pay their respects to the late Mr. Kennedy. A statement from former President Herbert Hoover, who informs the White House from New York as follows: I deeply regret that it will not be possible for me to go in person to pay my last respects to Mrs. Kennedy. Due to my recent illness, says former President Hoover, I am appointing my son, Herbert Hoover, Jr., to represent me at the funeral on Monday. I am appointing my son, Alan Hoover, says the former president, to represent me at the services in the Capitol Rotunda tomorrow. Herbert Hoover, Jr. presumably will arrive in Washington on Monday. Jim, one of the things that has come to my mind over the last couple of days, covering some of the ins and outs of this entire tragic event, is that, in a way, tragic as it was, it seems to me that some of the critics of this country, some of those who would wish us ill, some of those who would capitalize on such things as racial disorders, unemployment, and some of the other unfortunate things we have here, will perhaps, or might tend perhaps, to capitalize on this particular event as follows, by pointing, for example, to our saying in the recent past, we have an operating democracy here. Things that happened in the Dominican Republic, for example, where a chief of state is violently overthrown, or the Cuban Revolution, which disposed of Mr. Batista so rapidly, or what happened in Vietnam. We have said in the past, and I think quite rightly so, this can't happen in the United States. We've been very proud of this, and we've hit it quite hard on many occasions. It seems to me that some of the people overseas who don't see the broad overall aspects of this can point to the United States now and perhaps try to make capital among the some of the nations of the world who don't understand our system, pointing a finger at this country and say, well, it did happen in the United States. The violent overthrow of a duly elected president. Has that struck you?
You know, I was thinking about that earlier when I was talking with Morgan Beatty, Peter, and he put a slightly different interpretation on this, looked at it in terms of the upcoming political campaigns, which, of course, have already started. And he talked about the fact that this tragedy would definitely put a damper on the sort of rather reckless political statements that seem to be a part of a political campaign. We've seen those in past years. We know the type of campaign utterances that are made. And Morgan pointed out that he felt that we wouldn't have as much of that in the upcoming campaigns and in the conventions because of the death of the president. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think there's a certain tendency in that direction, Jim. Politics, of course, is politics in this country. It's always been rough and tumble since the country began, and perhaps that's the lifeblood of our democracy. But I agree with that. I think that there will be a tendency to try to hold it down, if you will, to there will always be in the background the memory of Mr. Kennedy. Speaking of politics, by the way, I think it's a tragic irony the gentleman who had been talked of. In fact, I had heard in the last couple of weeks that he planned to resign very shortly from his job as head of the Peace Corps. Sergeant Shriver, the president's brother-in-law, was to resign from the Peace Corps and begin active operations toward the re-election of Mr. Kennedy, that is to say, to become Mr. Kennedy's campaign manager. The irony, of course, the tragic irony is that Mr. Shriver has been appointed in charge of the funeral and burial arrangements for Mr. Kennedy.
That is tragic irony indeed, and of course we've heard stories out in Illinois that Sergeant Shriver might become the Democratic candidate for governor of Illinois, replacing Otto Kerner. I don't think that we have found any substance in this story whatsoever.
I've wondered about that, Jim. I, too, had heard that.
Well, Sergeant Shriver has denied it specifically and categorically, and I talked to Governor Otto Kerner only yesterday in Chicago before coming here, and Governor Kerner said definitely that he would be a candidate. He himself would be a candidate for re-election, that he intended to win. He said that he talked directly to Sergeant Shriver, and Sergeant Shriver had assured him positively that he had no intention whatsoever of being a candidate for the Democratic nomination as governor of Illinois.
And certainly, I suppose, the events of the last 2 days would underscore that.
I think that is absolutely right. It will completely underscore it. You know, we've been speculating about reaction in Cuba. We've heard some fragmentary reports earlier in the day, but right now, Peter, I would like to switch to a man who knows a great deal about this, John Wlw-Radio. He's standing by down in Miami, so let's switch now to John Wlw-Radio in Miami.
Havana Radio has just announced that Prime Minister Fidel Castro will make a special appearance on radio and television at 8 o'clock tonight. The Cuban government still has made no comment on the death of President Kennedy, and this well might be the first reaction to the president's assassination. Havana Radio, meanwhile, continues to keep the Cuban public informed about the news from the United States, reading American news agency dispatches without comment. John Wlw-Radio, NBC News, Miami.
Well, Peter, I suppose you heard that, too, from John Wlw-Radio down there, and that might underscore the very point that you were making about capital being made of the death of the president, right?
Well, it would look that way. It would be certainly in very poor, very bad taste at this moment, and I would predict that for the moment, for the time being at least, Mr. Castro's remarks will be slightly more tempered. I would hope so.
Well, I don't think Mr. Castro has been notorious for good taste in the past.
No, that is true. Nor have the Russians at times, and yet you'll recall the stories of the Soviet flags at half-staff and the top-level Russians who will attend the funeral. However, it remains to be seen what comes out of Havana, and that usually can be almost anything. Another one of the factors that I'm sure you've noticed, Jim, and perhaps have discussed here, is the totally unbelievable speed with which the tragic events of the last couple of days have unfolded. It's always a shock to read or hear or listen of the events surrounding the death of an important person, particularly one who was not ill and who was not expected to die at any particular time, was not near death. But when you stop to try to realize the speed with which this man's life ended, and his body was returned here, and the new president sworn in, and the new government continuing, it's not only a shock, but it leaves one rather stunned, even in this country. And I'm sure that a number of our friends abroad are having difficulty believing that some of these things have happened so quickly. It can't happen in almost any other country of the world.
Well, you know, I think this speed that you speak of is reflected in the fact that even now, more than 24 hours after the death of the president, a great many people across the nation find it very difficult, if not impossible, to accept it as reality. One of the men here in the studio said it's like a play. We don't feel that it's going to last. We'll get up the curtain, we'll come down, and it won't be real at all.
That's true. As pointed out perhaps by those gentlemen who are engaged in the space test in Texas. I'm not sure if you've seen that story.
We had a report on it earlier.
You
yes.
did, and their first reaction was, of course, disbelief. And it was only a short time later that the truth sunk in. Of course, they were even more shocked because just a day before they had seen the president looking in at them through that little window on the side of their simulated space capsule. So that must have been a real shock to them. I think probably the most interesting shock to them was the fact that the president showed up in the first place.
That's right. You know, somebody earlier today, and a great many people have talked about various phases of this thing, mentioned the fact that this has a great deal of impact on children all across the nation. They seem to identify very closely with President Kennedy, and children came home from school crying because they'd been told that the president was killed. Have you ever heard that reaction in Washington?
Yes. This is, I think, perhaps one of the most natural reactions for following a tragedy such as this, because Mr. Kennedy and his wife were the youngest couple to occupy the White House. Their children are very young. There's a great deal of association, I would imagine, in the minds of children across the country. They think of themselves, perhaps, or think of the Kennedy children as co-equals. There were a great many stories and a great many pictures. In fact, the most recent, this current issue of one of the national news magazines has a great series of pictures of Mr. Kennedy with his son, John. There is a great association there, and of course, the children were a great deal like any other children. They did the same things. They were spanked when they were naughty, and we had stories of that. They were given an ice cream cone now and then, and we had stories of that. They had any number of pets in and around the White House. And it was a great feeling of comfort, I would imagine, for the children of the United States and elsewhere, to realize that the children of the White House were and are very much like they are, living the same kinds of lives. And it must have been a great shock to them to understand finally that the father of these children is gone, and in fact the children themselves will be gone from the White House. I would compare the relationship there to a certain extent with the Teddy Roosevelt children, who were, perhaps you might call them, notoriously loved by the children and, incidentally, the adults of the land when Teddy Roosevelt was there. It was a great association.
I think that's quite true, and I think the children all across the nation identified themselves with Caroline and John, and I think that...
Who wouldn't?
That's right. I think on Monday we'll see many little children along the line of march, too.
Oh, I'm convinced of that. I think it has not yet been announced, and I'd love to know one of these days or one of these hours we will, whether we will get to see the Kennedy children during any of the formal funeral events.
Peter, a man that we know very little about, we're learning a little bit more about him each hour that goes by, is this man, Lee Harvey Oswald. We've heard reports earlier in the day from some people who were associated with him in the military service, as former Sergeant Goodwin. We've heard about his temperament in the military service, but we have a further report on his police record. A very interesting phase of this man, and it's a rather strange story. We're going to get that story from Chuck Woolsey in San Diego.
Authorities at San Diego's Marine Corps Recruit Depot and nearby Camp Pendleton say that no local records exist on one-time Marine sharpshooter and expert marksman Lee Oswald, formerly charged with the assassination of President John Kennedy. Marine officers say that base personnel records of Marines are destroyed a year after a man is discharged from service, unless that man has faced military charges. If a Marine has been the subject of military legal action, his records are kept for 3 years and then forwarded to Washington. Veteran Marines pointedly remarked today that Oswald is an ex-Marine and not a former Marine, stating that former Marine is the title used solely for those who have been honorably discharged from service. At military installations throughout the San Diego area, cannon fire echoes from the foothills to the Pacific each half hour. The rumbling long rifle fire in memory of President Kennedy will continue until sunset. This is Chuck Woolsey in San Diego.
That's the story from Chuck Woolsey. I'd like to point out some more bulletins coming in from overseas. Today, official mourning day for Mr. Kennedy throughout Yugoslavia, and all sports events and entertainments were canceled. All scheduled light radio TV programs changed to somber music and the themes. The newspapers devoting pages and pages and editorials to the murder of the president. And apparently genuine sympathy has been expressed by the people themselves in Yugoslavia. 10,000 of Yugoslavians lining up to sign memorials at the American Embassy in Yugoslavia. What do you think this means in terms of your comment on the overseas reaction, Peter? At the moment, I think Peter Hackett has gone off to something else. He's investigating another phase of the story. We had a report earlier that I might repeat now that, speaking of Yugoslavia, we had a report from Belgrade that the official newspaper Borba suggested today that attempts were being made to poison the atmosphere by stressing that the man accused of murdering President Kennedy was married to a Russian and had lived in Russia. Borba said such tactics were reminiscent of the Nazi attempts to prove that the burning of the German Reichstag in 1933 was the work of communists. So the official newspaper Borba reflects one reaction to this tragedy. The people of Yugoslavia reflect quite a different one. In Moscow, the Communist Party newspaper Pravda today charged that American reactionaries were trying to make use of the president's tragic death in order to fan anti-Soviet and anti-Cuban hysteria. Pravda called the murder a monstrous crime and mentioned the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald in connection with the assassination. It said, and I'm quoting, "The more details are being reported, the more obscure and suspect the whole affair is becoming. From reports based on statements made by police officers of Dallas, only one thing is clear by now," said Pravda. "The police obviously want to implicate the Communist Party in the murder of the president." And Pravda said, "Everybody in America knows that it is precisely in Texas, in the eternally Republican state, as they say here, that are nesting the most reactionary and rabid elements, the Birches and the followers of Senator Goldwater and of the mutineer and racist Walker." That is a direct quote from the Communist Party newspaper Pravda in Moscow. The article said about a month ago, Texas extremists attacking the United Nations delegate Adlai Stevenson, and that while attacking him, the hooligans shouted, "Down with coexistence and down with the traitor Kennedy." This is the article in Pravda, but we've already heard a report from Ambassador Stevenson about his part in that incident in Dallas, and we've heard his conversation with Martin Agronsky in Washington on this. We know that tonight, at I believe it is 8:30 our time, Fidel Castro is going to go on the air in Havana. This reported by John Hlavacek in Miami. That'll be at 8 o'clock, and at that time we're going to hear still another official reaction from behind the Iron Curtain to the death of President Kennedy. But all through this day, as we've heard these official reactions from the Iron Curtain countries and their friends, we've seen a distinct difference between the reaction of the common people and the official reaction. Everywhere around the world, and we have still no real report from Communist China, everywhere else except Communist China, the average man has reacted in the same way, a great sense of shock that this tragedy should happen, and an identification of President Kennedy with all Americans. And some of our reporters overseas told about having foreign reporters and foreign dignitaries coming up to them and taking their hand and expressing sorrow directly to them that the president had been killed. And I think this is the sort of thing that reflects the true reaction of people around the world to the assassination of President Kennedy. In Hyannisport, we talked about the grief of the father who lost a son and the reaction of 75-year-old Joseph Kennedy 21 hours after the rest of the world knew of the president's assassination. We know that the tragic news had been withheld from Ambassador Kennedy until today because of his poor physical condition from a stroke he suffered in December of 1961. We know now that the younger of his two surviving sons, Senator Edward M. Kennedy, broke the news to his ailing father in an upstairs bedroom of the main house in the Kennedy Cape Cod compound. The late president's father took the grim news very well, we're told, according to a source close to the family. The source told newsmen he'd expected the elder Kennedy to take the news harder than he did, but surprisingly, the patriarch of the clan reportedly did not break up. With him at the time were his wife, Mrs. Rose Kennedy, and a daughter, Mrs. Eunice Shriver, wife of Sergeant Shriver, head of the Peace Corps. You've heard of all of these things. There is more to come. This is Jim Hurlbut, NBC News, New York.
You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
We've been talking about developments out in Dallas, Texas, and those developments are coming rather fast out there now. The man who has been on top of the story is another, not Tom Pettit, but Tom Perryman in Dallas. And let's switch now to Tom Perryman in Dallas. Well, they tell me our circuit isn't up at this time. We're going to go very shortly to Dallas for that report. I understand it's going to be about 5 minutes before this will be available. And we have a lot to talk about between now and then. I think that we were talking with Peter Jfk'S about the children of President Kennedy and about the identification of children everywhere with these two youngsters, 6-year-old Caroline and little John John. We know that they were told the sad news of their father's death. They went with their mother to a private mass this morning in the great East Ballroom of the White House. And Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, whose courage had been remarked by all who saw her, tried to console her children. After all she'd been through, this 34-year-old widow of President Kennedy still faces the ordeal of the funeral, with the heads of many states coming to pay tribute to the fallen leader. Mrs. Kennedy will ride tomorrow in a slow, mournful procession as a caisson drawn by 7 horses carries Mr. Kennedy's body to rest in state in the rotunda of the Capitol, where she used to send him hot lunches when he served in the Senate. On Monday, which was to have been a gala family celebration of the 3rd birthday of little John John, Mrs. Kennedy will attend the funeral mass. For more than 16 hours after her husband was shot, Mrs. Kennedy refused to leave the body. She accompanied the casket on that jet plane. She accompanied it in the ambulance by which it was taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital last night to be prepared for burial. She's had very little sleep. It was after 4 o'clock this morning when she again rode in the ambulance to bring Mr. Kennedy's body back to the White House to lie in state in the East Room, where it is now. Now we're getting more developments on the opposite side of this picture. We've got a statement issued today here in New York by the United States Communist Party. It was made public by Arnold Johnson, the party's public relations man. He says, in view of the fact that attempts are being made to link the suspected assassin with the Communist Party, we want to reiterate our complete condemnation of the dastardly assassination of President John F. Kennedy as a monstrous crime against the country. We again declare that the murder of the president only serves the purpose of those who seek to destroy democracy, those who seek to throw this country into terror and fascism. This act, as the statement issued by Arnold Johnson, the Communist Party's public relations man in the United States, this act could only be the work of a mentally deranged person or the deliberate deed of an enemy of democracy, an agent of the ultra-right advocates of violence. We categorically deny all insinuations or declarations that anybody that the suspect now arrested, Lee H. Oswald, has any association with the Communist Party. We further declare that such acts of violence and terror are diametrically the opposite of the policy and program of the Communist Party. Attempts to use this brutal act to whip up hysteria against the Communist Party or against progressive movements only compound the crime against the president and the country and serve to cover up those who've encouraged this tragic deed. And it's quite interesting to note that this statement issued by the Communist Party's public relations man in the United States follows very closely the official proclamation by the Soviet radio and the Moscow radio and by the Soviet news agency TASS, which said exactly the same thing. Going back to Oswald, and they keep referring to Oswald, police in Dallas said flatly today that Lee Oswald, a pro-Castro Marxist and one-time defector to Russia, assassinated President Kennedy, and they have the evidence to prove it, including what they referred to as a new development. We don't know what this new development is, but they said that Oswald had no accomplices, though they continued to question several men, apparently in connection with the 24-year-old ex-Marine's movements before and after a sniper fired 2 bullets into President Kennedy from ambush in downtown Dallas. Chief of Homicide Captain Will Fritz down there said there was a new development in the case since this morning. He said, "I am not in a position to reveal it. However, we are sure of our case." The district attorney cautiously agreed with Fritz. He said there was no question but that they would seek the death penalty for Oswald, who has maintained his innocence since his arrest less than 2 hours after the assassination. Jim Hurlbut, NBC News, New York.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We now pause for station identification.
This is your Clear Channel service, Wlw in Cincinnati.
We've been talking about developments down in Dallas, and we told you 5 minutes ago that we were going to talk to Tom Perryman down there. He's been very close to this story, and I think we can get a much more accurate view of what's going on in Dallas by talking directly to Tom Perryman. So let's switch to Tom Perryman in Dallas.
Jim, the latest development is here in Dallas. Captain Will Fritz stepped out of his office at the Dallas Police Headquarters just a short while ago to announce that the police have information that the rifle used in the assassination of John F. Kennedy was purchased through a Chicago mail order house. Interrogation will continue in a short while at Dallas Police Headquarters of Oswald, and in a short while, it's believed tonight, he'll be transferred to the county jail. About 50 reporters down at the county jail from where we just came, standing by and waiting for the arrival of Oswald. But as of yet, he has been resting much of the last hour, we are told, and will be transferred to the county jail sometime tonight after more interrogation. That's the latest information from here, Jim.
Well, you talk about this rifle that was used. As I recall, it has been described as a 7.5 millimeter foreign-made rifle, apparently of Italian make. Is that correct?
It was made in Germany. We are told it's a model 91, which means 1891. It doesn't mean it was made in that year, but probably it is 20 to 30 years old. We talked with a gunsmith who informed us that the rifle began production in Germany, and there are 2 or 3 shops and places in Germany that it could have been made. But they started making them in 1891 and continued on through World War I. So we don't know how old the rifle is, but it is from an old model, and it was made, we understand, for the Argentine government, that model was.
Captain Fritz indicated that there is a new development in the case since this morning. He says he's not in a position to reveal what this new development is. Do you have any idea in what area this new development might fall?
We don't know for sure, Jim, if it is not the paraffin test. We understand the paraffin tests of the cheek and hands of Oswald were positive. The police have given us quite a bit of information, but they have refused to go into evidence. We have talked with the district attorney, and they've been very helpful in giving us what they could, but of course they want to withhold any evidence that they have. Now, supposedly there is 1 or 2 eyewitnesses or more. We'll say a eyewitness or more than one, and perhaps that Oswald was seen leaving the building after the assassination. We're not sure. Possibly that's what they have, because Oswald was picked out of a lineup, we understand.
Earlier, we talked with Morgan Beatty, who's been going into some of the federal phases of the investigation, and he said that there was a massive search underway in Dallas and elsewhere, too, for every tiny bit of evidence which might link together to form a case against the man who will be charged with this murder. Do you have any idea, Tom, how many officials, whether they're local police officers or federal agents or whatnot, are at work on this case down in Dallas?
We don't have any number. We know that all law enforcement agencies in Texas, including the Texas Rangers, the state officials, and, of course, the FBI here in Dallas and from out of town and the Secret Service are all working together. As far as numbers, we don't know. We know there are a lot here, and they are scanning the area, scrutinizing everything to find out what they can about this. The parents of Oswald came down a while ago and would not say anything to reporters. They evidently were questioned or at least talked to. And also, as you know, one person who worked in the warehouse with Oswald, a man named Molina, was also taken into custody, not arrested, however, but questioned concerning this. I don't know how many men are working on the case at all, but I know probably more than any other case ever in the country.
Well, the man who hired Oswald for that temporary job in the book repository described him as a nice-appearing, polite young man. Do you think this description fits Oswald?
Well, we had information from the sergeant at Camp Pendleton that Oswald, who was a sharpshooter in the Marines, had a lot of arguments with his fellow men, and the sergeant was quoted as saying he was glad to see him leave Camp Pendleton when Oswald did leave. We don't know too much about the personality. His housekeeper in the room that he rented in Oak Cliff reported he said very little. In fact, sometimes he wouldn't even answer when she said hello to him.
Well, we understand that Oswald now does have a lawyer. This lawyer, John Apt, I believe the name is. Do you know if Apt is in Dallas now? Have you seen him?
I have not seen him, and I don't know if he is here or not.
Yeah, however, do you understand that he will come to Dallas and confer with Oswald, and has he accepted Oswald as a client?
I don't know for sure. I know that Oswald was trying to reach him a while ago, that he was supposedly in New York, and I believe he is on his way in. I have information that he might be, but as far as being sure, I don't know.
Tom, down there in Dallas, we've been talking about the reaction of the city to this dastardly crime, and I think it's reasonable to use that phrase. Do you think that the city feels a sense of general guilt that this happened in Dallas? Do you think they feel a sense of responsibility for it?
Well, I don't believe it could be avoided that they wouldn't feel certainly embarrassed that it happened here, and so ashamed that it happened here, that it happened at all in your own hometown. It's something that it's hard to describe. And I'm sure most of the people in Dallas, the reporters here that we've talked to, they all feel the same way, very grieved so much that it happened here in Dallas. And, of course, happened at all, but especially right here, just a few blocks away.
Is there any indication now, Tom, that activity at police headquarters in Dallas is going to slacken up now? It's what, 5 o'clock out there, is it?
It's just after 6 here.
Just after 6 in Dallas. Do you think at this time the activity is going to slacken up for the night?
Probably not until Oswald is transferred to the county jail. As we told you, we just left the county jail area where we thought Oswald was going to be taken a short while ago. And there's about 50 or maybe 60 reporters, mostly photographers, standing by, ready to greet Mr. Oswald when he is brought to the county jail and transferred from the Dallas police headquarters, where he's being interrogated at this time. And he was reported resting a while ago because they've been talking to him all day, we understand. And he was going through some more interrogation, and later tonight probably will be transferred to the county jail. And until he's transferred, I'm sure there will be quite a bit of activity down at the police headquarters.
Earlier today, Tom, the police chief in Dallas was quoted as saying that he had been told that the FBI had questioned Oswald a week or so ago, and that it had him under surveillance at that time. Then he came back and said that he only heard this story secondhand, and he had no real confirmation of it. And we have a bit of confirmation now from Washington. A spokesman for the FBI says it is incorrect that the FBI has questioned Oswald or had him under surveillance at any time in recent months. And I think that maybe we have some more on this story from Washington right now. Peter Hackus, as I told you before, had gone off to check something else, and this may be what Peter's been on. And let's switch to Peter Hackus in Washington. Stay on, Tom.
Jim and Tom, both of you, I wish I could add to that. I was actually checking something else, which I'll get to in a minute.
However, I'd like to ask Tom this question, and perhaps it's been answered at least to some extent. Is there any possibility, any feeling, any indication whatever in Texas that this whole thing goes beyond one man or beyond two men in any direction whatever? That it may be a plot or could have been?
Well, Peter, we were asked the same question about an hour ago by a man from Radio Free Berlin who's here covering, and we answered that perhaps so. He was connected with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He was in New Orleans recently. There has been questions to this direction, but no evidence.
I have recently covered a number of the hearings before the House Un-American Activities, Tom, here in Washington, as you recall, which concerned the very group with which this gentleman has been associated. And from the evidence that was presented by them before the House Un-American Activities Committee, that is the group that went to Cuba in violation of the U.S. passport restrictions, it's within the realm of possibility in my imagination anyway.
It could be, very well.
Tom, I want to ask another question about a part of the story down there in Dallas. We've had some reports on the condition of Governor John Connally. Do you have a report on that now?
Yes, he's reported in satisfactory condition, and one of his aides says that the governor, while the doctor recommending he stay in the hospital 10 to 12 days, may not stay that long. We don't know if he will or not here at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. The Lieutenant Governor, Preston Smith, reports that Connally is still leading the state as executive head, and as far as he knows, he will remain at that position. And Connally is still governor and taking care of the executive information and everything from the aides there at the hospital. The aides more or less giving out the orders of the governor.
Who will go or who has gone to Washington to represent the state of Texas? Do you know, Tom?
I don't know how many will be going. I know several of the officials of the churches here, and over in Fort Worth, several are going up there representing several churches and civic groups. I don't know how many, and I don't know specifically who will be going.
Tom, may I ask a question? This is Jfk'S in Washington again. Of course, the Secret Service took, I'm sure, whatever precautions they were supposed to have taken. And yet, somewhere along the line, they just couldn't cover every window along the line of march, obviously. Did you note any feeling in the time that immediately followed this tragedy among the Secret Service agents, or did you hear anything with regard to perhaps somebody feeling that they had failed, and if so, why?
Well, there's no question that this area wasn't watched, the building wasn't watched, but as I told someone a short while ago, there were probably 100 places that the president could have been shot if he was not shot at the area from the Texas School Book Depository building. By the way, the county jail where Oswald will be transferred possibly later tonight is practically in the shadow of where the building is, and it's actually at the same corner just back a few yards from where the assassination occurred. Very clear and visible from where he'll be transferred, and the car will be pulled up into the back of the county jail, and right across the street is where the assassination took place.
Tom, let me ask a question. This is Jim Hurlbut in New York again. Is there any indication at this time of any public action against Oswald? Are there crowds gathering outside the jail, crowds of people?
Yes, at the jail. I don't say against Oswald. I think they're mainly curious to see what's going on. It was almost a setting like the welcome that the late president was being given yesterday before being shot, because the people were behind ropes along the street just across from the jail, exactly in the area where President Kennedy, the late President Kennedy, had been driven by just a day ago, plus a few hours.
What is the
and
mood?
They're there watching, and they, I assume, were trying to catch a glimpse of Oswald when he was brought to the county jail, when he will be brought there. And there's several hundred out there watching right now, being held back by the police.
What is the mood of that crowd? Is it an angry, sullen crowd?
No, I don't think so. I believe it's strictly curious. As far as doing things down here, the Dallas County judge, Lou Sterrett, is going to meet with the mayor, and we talked with both a short while ago, and they are going to appoint a committee to have a monument erected near the area where the president was assassinated. We don't know what they're going to do, how they'll recommend this be done, or what the further details will be on it, but they will name a committee to work on arranging for a monument, a memoriam to the late President Kennedy.
Peter, do you have anything to ask Tom?
Not at this point, except I listened to you begin a question about the mood. I expect you were going to continue about the mood of the people of the city of Dallas. It's hard to assess the mood of a city as large as Dallas, so many individuals, but perhaps Tom can give us a little briefing on that.
Well, I think everyone is so, as I say, so ashamed that it happened here. Everybody feels so badly about it. It's so gloomy. As I drove down to the downtown area today from my home, it was a beautiful day, just like it was yesterday, not a cloud in the sky, and I thought of how moody everything seemed to be. It seemed like a Sunday when everything almost comes to a still. A lot of traffic, but everyone seemed so gloomy. There's no excitement in Dallas as normal.
Little elation, I suppose, if any, over the fact that the new president of the United States happens to be a Texan.
Peter,
well,
let me...
That was...
Pardon me, Tom, go ahead.
I was just going to say that was commented on a while ago by the lieutenant governor, and of course the prayers and all of Texas and the nation will go with the new president who happens to be from Texas, but there's been no mention or anything to indicate that we're proud of the fact that he took the position from the assassination, of course.
Peter Hackerson in Washington, let me ask you about this guilt on the part of Dallas. Actually, this assassination of the president could happen in any city in the United States. Isn't it true that this kind of an attack is the thing that Secret Service agents fear the most? This is the most difficult thing to guard against?
This is the thing they really do fear. And with all due respect to the Secret Service, they have had in the past a very tough job in trying to do their job, and their job, of course, is to protect Mr. Kennedy. He was notorious for trying to run away from them. Now, he did it, of course, good-naturedly and in the spirit of political fun and what have you, but this is the kind of thing that makes the Secret Service men lose their hair. I had been with the president on many occasions when he, for example, would land at an airport, and there, instead of the scheduled crowd of 300 or 400, there might have been 12 or 1,500, and they were cheering, and it was a bright, sunny day, perhaps, and he was in a good mood, and he would practically outwalk the Secret Service, and dart here and dart there, and just disappear in the crowd. At times you'd look and you wouldn't be able to see the president. He was surrounded by people. This type of jostling is the thing that really makes the Secret Service nervous. I was wondering, because of the Adlai Stevenson incident so recently in Texas, I was wondering if Tom had heard anything, in retrospect, of course, to the effect that anyone had recommended that the bubble on the bubble-top car perhaps should have been down, and that someone might have thought that and that had discarded that idea.
Well, Pete, that has been mentioned. They called up. A lot of people would call up on the phone and say, why wasn't it up? Didn't they know any better? But as I said, I believe any time a man walks out of a house, such as the White House, for instance, he's not invulnerable, and he cannot be protected, I don't believe, to the degree that it would be necessary for it to be 100% safe every minute of every day. And like I said, he could have been shot at probably 100 different places in downtown Dallas.
Sure.
And he was
I'm
almost
sure.
through with the motorcade when
Well,
he was
we're
shot.
looking at it, of course, from hindsight, and I would expect that henceforward, at least for the near future, the security operations surrounding President Johnson will be considerably more elaborate.
Well, speaking of that, Peter, are you familiar with what precautions are being taken to protect the president on Monday? I don't remember who I was talking to earlier, about the great security problem that's going to exist in Washington on Monday, with so many heads of state there, so many people of great importance whose lives are always in jeopardy, almost every minute of all the time, because of acts of this sort.
I don't have that specifically in front of me, Jim. Perhaps I could try to find that out for you.
Peter, is there anything else you want to add at this time in our conversation with Tom Perriman down in Dallas?
I think that about does it. It's, as he said, a continuing sad story for the city of Dallas, and I'm sure there are many hundreds of thousands of prayers being said there. But as he so ably pointed out, as only a person from that city can, it certainly could have happened in any number of places.
Well, thank you very much, Tom Perriman down in Dallas, and thank you, too, Peter Jfk'S in Washington, for this good three-way report on activities in Dallas. You talk about the tributes to Mr. Kennedy, and it's kind of interesting, from Catania, Sicily, a story of composer Igor Stravinsky, who tonight honored the late President Kennedy by conducting his Requiem Mass instead of another of his works at a concert in Catania. The 81-year-old Stravinsky dedicated the performance to Mr. Kennedy without comment. Anything he could say, he said, would be obvious and rhetorical. He told that to newsmen afterward. You know, last year on his 80th birthday, Igor Stravinsky was received by Mr. Kennedy at the White House. Now, we've got more developments going on all across the country, but again, we are going to switch to, not to the nation's capital, not to Boston or any of the other great capitals, switch down to Bob Johnson, who has a very interesting sidebar story on this down at Huntington, West Virginia.
Perhaps the forgotten tragedy of this monstrous weekend, the shooting death of Dallas policeman J.D. Tippit, has brought reaction from West Virginians 1,000 miles away. People began calling WSAZ in Huntington this afternoon after an NBC report that the policeman's family will receive no pension. They called simply to know if they could help. We checked with NBC's WBAP in Fort Worth, Dallas, found that indeed no plan has yet been set up, but that the Dallas Police Department would be willing to accept any funds for the Tippit family. The word is out, and folks in West Virginia, who had a special place in their hearts for John Kennedy, respond here for the family of a police officer slain in what may have been a tragedy related to the president's assassination. As one caller told us, it's certainly not much, but it's the first time in 24 hours I felt like doing anything. Bob Johnson, NBC in Huntington, West Virginia.
That was the report from Bob Johnson. Jim Hurlbut, NBC News, New York. I'm going to go on now and give some summary of official actions that have been taken in the wake of President Johnson proclaiming Monday a national day of mourning. One of those actions from Washington affects mail deliveries. Report is that there will be no postal deliveries on Monday, and post offices generally will be closed. President Johnson, as we know, has proclaimed this a national day of mourning, as I've just said, and Postmaster General John A. Gronowski announced the closing tonight of the post offices, but said he has authorized all postmasters to make available certain essential mail services to meet urgent community needs. In such cases, limited window services will be provided for business mailers. We also had a report earlier that Comptroller James J. Saxon gave his approval today to the closing of banks on Monday, and that he urged all of the banks across the nation to take that action where the law allows it. It is the presumption of this office, said Mr. Saxon, that all national banks will appropriately observe the clear non-business implications of the President's proclamation by the adoption of suitable action. In his statement, he said that in several states, the governors or other state authorities have already acted to authorize banks to close. Similar action may soon be expected in other states. And we're advised, said Mr. Saxon in his statement, that banks or groups of banks in other states have already determined to remain closed for all or part of Monday. This office strongly approves the action so far taken and urges the adoption of similar action in the remaining states where authorized by local law or practice. And now we'll be back with more on this. Oh, I'm told that I better go on and talk for another minute. You know, we talk about communications. We've got communications all around the world. We can bring in world capitals at a moment's notice. We can bring in any place in the United States. But sometimes it's rather difficult, close at hand, to get a definitive word because of the intense activity that goes on here. I wanted to add a report that we've had here in New York, an official announcement that the United Nations will be closed on Monday, November 25th, the day of President Kennedy's funeral, and the UN then will be even closed to visitors. We talked earlier with Pauline Frederick over at the UN. She said that today, despite the fact that the UN was closed, there were an unusual number of visitors in the United Nations building. People came there just to look and to stand and to perhaps think about the implications of this act on not only the United States, but the whole world. We also heard that it will be a 30-day period of mourning here in New York State. That was officially proclaimed today by Governor Nelson Rockefeller. And now I am told it is time for me to say, this is Jim Hurlbut, NBC News, New York.
For those local stations that might have some local news or public service announcements of local importance, we will provide stations with approximately 4 minutes for this purpose at 5 minutes before the hour and the half hour. The network will, however, continue coverage during this period. The following is the cutaway cue. You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
We've been talking now for the last few minutes about the acts implementing the announcement by President Johnson today, the official proclamation that Monday will be a day of mourning. Our colleague Peter Hackett has been standing by down in Washington. Peter, let's switch to you.
President Johnson will address a joint session of the Congress here next Wednesday. The chief executive is expected to appeal for unity. The high administration had said earlier that Mr. Johnson would address Congress, and then he added, "I do not expect it to be a program speech or a partisan speech." However, one other source does say that he expects it will be a major policy speech, so we really don't know at this point. This will take place at 12:30 p.m. Washington time, that's Eastern Standard, on Wednesday. You may recall that Harry Truman made a similar unity appeal to Congress April 16, 1945, 4 days after Mr. Roosevelt's death made him president. The leaders of Congress are, of course, still in a sort of state of shock following Mr. Kennedy's death, and who knows what effect this will have as the Congress continues to try to get something done. Senator Mansfield of Montana, the Senate Majority Leader, has announced that the plans for the Senate, the immediate plans, are to push ahead with the legislative program next week, aiming for a December 20 to January 2nd Christmas recess. Mansfield says that he may even seek a Thanksgiving Day Senate session if it seems to be something that would be desirable. Mansfield went on to say that the Senate would meet on Monday, but only long enough for the official announcement of Mr. Kennedy's death, the adoption of a resolution of grief and sympathy, and the appointment of a committee to attend the president's funeral. Incidentally, of course, Jim, as you know, President Johnson, as president, has quite an advantage in his relations with Congress. Of course, Mr. Kennedy did too. He is personally friendly with most, if not all, the members of the Senate and the House, and of course all of the influential ones, and he has quite a reputation for what they say in polite circles is skilled legislative maneuvering. And, of course, how effective this is going to be with him in the White House working with Congress remains to be seen. But he was quite effective, needless to say, when he was the Senate Majority Leader. Jim?
I think, Peter, that earlier Edwin Newman commented on that, too, and he said this long association with the Congress as a member of that body doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have good relations with it as the president. He pointed out, as I recall, that President Truman had a fairly long experience, not as long, of course, as President Johnson by any means, but had a long experience with the Congress, and that he had his troubles with the Congress after he became president. And it was true, too, that Mr. Kennedy had a long experience, relatively speaking, with the Congress, but sometimes he had his problems, too. There's much more to talk about, though, and we'll be back after this message.
The NBC Radio Network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We pause now for station identification.
WLW in Cincinnati and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join our listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our president.
Peter Haggis, I've got an interesting note in my hand, a report from London, that British Television Weekly Satire, you know the program, That Was the Week That Was, devoted its entire program tonight to an appreciation of President Kennedy. And the biting satire of this weekly program was dropped for once, as actors and actresses each made a solemn tribute to the dead president. And the report says the studio audience received the program in complete and unprecedented silence. And I might add to that, Peter, that last night here in New York, all the legitimate theaters closed down, and a good many of the movie theaters, too, were closed. But now they're opening again tonight, and most of them are back with regular performances, both the matinee today and the evening performance. What about the situation in Washington in that regard?
That is similarly true here. Almost everything has been shut down. When they will resume, of course, is not known because we're so wrapped up in the actual funeral arrangements at the moment. I suspect everything will be shut down at least until perhaps Monday night. The story out of London is, of course, very interesting. I was speculating with a friend of mine just a moment ago on the future of the host of people whose careers are based on imitations of Mr. Kennedy and the Kennedy family, and wondering if this means the end of their career, and then again how long it will take for people of this same nature to begin on President Johnson. This is a phenomenon we haven't had except in recent years, and of course something like this, I would imagine, will end a few careers.
Well, I'm sure that's true. You know, Peter, we were talking with Tom Perriman a little while ago, and we were talking about the situation in Dallas and commenting on Oswald. And we've got some good reaction on that, and I'd like to turn to that now. We have a report, a reaction on the Oswald case from H. Lewis Nichols, chairman of the Dallas Bar Association.
I am the president of the Dallas Bar Association, the organized bar here in Dallas. We had been advised that statements had been made that Mr. Oswald was unable to get any Dallas lawyer who would make any inquiry about the representation, or that he was unable to get any representation here in Dallas. When I heard about that this afternoon, I decided that I should come down and make inquiry as to whether or not he was represented by counsel, whether or not he desired to be represented by counsel, and whether or not he would ask the Dallas Bar Association to furnish representation to him. I have just visited with him in his cell, and he advises that his first preference is that he be represented by a lawyer in New York, whose name I believe is John Abt, A-B-T. He then stated that if he could not be represented by that individual, he would like to have a lawyer who was a member of the American Civil Liberties Union represent him. He said that if he was unable to get anyone from that organization, why then he might call upon the local bar association to represent him. I asked him whether or not at this time he was asking the Dallas Bar Association to do anything toward representing him, and he advised that he was not, that he did not desire that we take any steps toward obtaining representation for him, and that if he was unable to obtain the other representation, he might at a later time ask us to do so, and did ask that I would check back with him at a later time to see whether or not there would be any necessity or desirability that we attempt to furnish representation for him. Having contacted him and satisfied myself that he was not being deprived of representation by an attorney, and having satisfied myself that he did not desire to be represented by a Dallas attorney, I then left, and that's the situation as it exists right now.
That is certainly an interesting report from the president of the Dallas Bar Association on legal representation for Oswald.
Jim, it strikes me that the officials in charge of this case are going to be faced with one of the most difficult court events in U.S. history. From this standpoint, whether or not this man, this youth, gets what we call a fair trial is going to be paramount in the minds of a good many people. I think some of the legal technicalities as to how prejudiced the jurors might be, merely based on what they have heard up to now, is going to be a very touchy and difficult decision on the part of someone to make. I have no doubt that it's going to be handled in expert fashion, but it is a very touchy one. I would imagine the mood in Dallas, as it is in most areas of this country and indeed elsewhere, is somewhat against the defendant. And whether he's guilty, as some say he is, or let's put it this way, there are ramifications to this thing which I think are going to take a really trained lawyer to walk the straight and narrow.
Oh, I agree entirely with that, Peter. We were talking earlier to Morgan Beatty, who had been delving into that phase of the story at considerable length today, and he pointed out the thing that we've touched on, too, in talking to Tom Perriman, the intense effort that's being made to carefully document the case that will be brought against the man who will be brought to trial. That there will be, as Morgan phrased it, and I think somebody else phrased it before him, and me too, as a matter of fact, no stone will be left unturned. It's a cliche that I think well describes the effort that is being made to bring out every possible piece of physical evidence that will document this case. And that by presenting this great skein of evidence from the rifle that was used, the paraffin tests, the tests on the bullets, the cartridges that were used, that the case that will be presented to the jury will be presented purely on the basis of physical evidence, and there won't be any effort to bring an emotional phase of the case into focus in this particular instance. And I think that extraordinary efforts are being taken to guard against that happening, and I think this is what you're saying too, right?
Yes, I was saying that and something else. I think in addition to that, it's going to be very difficult for the judge who presides in this case and for some of the attorneys who will be involved in it to present what would normally be considered a fair trial. For example, take the selection of the jurors. How many jurors perhaps might be rejected on the grounds that what they had seen on television, heard on radio, read in the newspapers, might already have prejudiced them against this young man. Now, I'm not saying that their prejudices are perhaps not logical, but from a technically legal standpoint, there are going to be some touchy questions that come up as to whether this man gets a fair trial.
Pardon me, go ahead, Peter.
No, I'm just thinking in the selection of the jurors.
I think we were talking about that, too, earlier, and that we pointed out that modern communications, are going to work both for and against this situation, that because of our tremendous communication advantages, there will be some tendency to perhaps inflame prospective jurors to a degree, but also, because of this communication, everyone will have a more thorough understanding of all the factors that are involved in this case, and instead of having a rather uninformed reaction to the case, the people are reacting from an informed point of view, that they are not, as Tom Perriman told us down in Dallas, there was not any particular indication of any hysterical resentment against the man that's in custody there, but instead the people were just there intensely curious about what was going on. And have you heard reflected in Washington, Peter, a violent antagonism toward this man as an individual?
Well, I think that most people here feel they don't know all of the facts in this case, but also I think most people feel, that is here in Washington, that they don't need to know all of the facts. Here was a man who lived among us, and when I say us, I mean the residents of this particular city. We see the president, we live in close proximity with him. We see him when he moves around the city. We see him take off with his helicopter. We see him on motorcades. We see him greeting dignitaries. We see him in various, we see him playing on the White House lawn even with his children occasionally. So the people of this city, I think, feel a unique kinship with the resident of the White House. And there is, I must admit, there is resentment here about the whole case, and I think that this gentleman is blamed, either rightly or wrongly, based on the evidence as it has been presented by, as you say, the various means of communication.
On another phase of the story in Washington, Peter, we've been talking about the death of the president and the actions that are going to take place honoring him and his funeral, which will come up on Monday. But for the first time now, we have another president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, putting in a full day in office as the new president of our nation. And it has been a full day for President Johnson, has it not?
That it has. I watched him. I was out there this morning at his home in a section of northwest Washington called Spring Valley, and he left there, I was going to say the crack of dawn, it was close to it, to drive downtown, as he has for a couple of years now, in the same automobile from the same home. But today, for the first time, he was riding into town, a trip that takes about 12 minutes with motorcycle escort, as the President of the United States. I wondered, as I'm sure many of those who watched did, what thoughts were going through his mind at the time. His face was rather intense. I doubt that he had much sleep last night, if any. He carried, as I looked at him sitting on the right side of the back seat of this limousine, he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. It is, perhaps, as some have said, the most difficult job in the world. One thing I had, when you called before and when I was on the telephone and couldn't answer you, there has been selected, that is to say, the people who are arranging for the funeral procession have decided that walking in the procession shall be 3 members of the leading religions in the United States, that is, Protestantism, Judaism, and Catholicism. And I had found that they had picked the Protestant representative, who is a Washingtonian, Dean Francis B. Sayre, of the Washington Cathedral. a rather good and appropriate choice. He was an old friend of Mr. Kennedy, and very much associated with the White House in Washington. He's the grandson of Woodrow Wilson. In fact, he was born in the White House. And he knew Mr. Kennedy. In fact, they didn't know each other in service, but they both served in the Navy. In fact, Dean Sayre has 12 battle stars to his credit. And Dean Sayre, I was talking with him the other day, mentioned to me that one of the things Mr. Kennedy asked him about some time ago was the matter of the church-state question. You may recall during the campaign, this at one point threatened to flare up into quite an issue because Mr. Kennedy was a Catholic, and the question of separation of church and state and aid to education and so on. And he and Dean Sayre apparently had a number of talks about this, and Mr. Kennedy's liberalism on this point was quite notable. At least this is what Dean Sayre told me. So he will represent the Protestant church denominations of the country. I don't know the names of the other two. The Jewish representative, I'm told, is a rabbi from your city, Chicago.
Rabbi Mann?
I don't know.
Mann?
I just don't know.
I haven't seen that either.
I have one other note. An entire room in the White House, we're told, is filled with floral offerings which have poured into the presidential residence since the announcement of Mr. Kennedy's death. This, of course, is despite requests from the Kennedy family that rather than flowers, the money that would be spent for flowers be given to a charitable purpose. The White House, of course, is grateful for the flowers and the thought behind them, but they, again, repeat the request that the money go instead to charity.
You know, we've been talking before, Peter, about the extraordinary security measures that are taken to protect the president, and the same security extends to all the members of his family. I have a story from Austin, Texas, that President Johnson's daughter, Linda Bird, who's a sophomore at the University of Texas in Austin, was taken from her dormitory yesterday afternoon by Secret Service men, and they were asked where they were taking her. They told Linda Bird that they would tell her after they left the dormitory. This story was related to reporters by Becky Alexander, who was Linda Bird's cousin and roommate, and the Secret Service men refused to answer any queries concerning the president's daughter. Do you have any further information on that phase of it?
Well, I don't have any information on that particular phase of it, but the president has another daughter, Lucy, who attends a private school here in Washington called the National Cathedral School for Girls, which is connected with the Washington Cathedral. And moments after the shooting, a horde of local policemen was at the school, up and down the corridors, and they did a rather similar thing with the other daughter, Lucy, for her own protection, of course, and the school was in something of a turmoil for a few moments.
We've been talking also, Peter, about the heads of state and representatives of state who will be in Washington for the funeral. We have a story in now from Tokyo that Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda will attend President Kennedy's funeral. This was an official government announcement. Earlier, it had been announced that Foreign Minister Masayoshi Ohira would head the Japanese funeral delegation because Ikeda's presence was required in the capital in the wake of last week's general elections. And this decision to send Ikeda was made in a cabinet meeting called when it was learned that French President Charles de Gaulle and British Prime Minister Alec Douglas Hume would attend the funeral in Washington on Monday. We also have information, and I know that you can confirm this story, that former Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy will not be able to attend the funeral of his son.
Yes, that is correct. He has sent that word. In fact, his wife Rose has let that be known. One other little item that crossed my mind when we were listening to the report on the three-way conversation with Dallas, among other pieces of legislation which I'm sure will be affected by the recent turn of events, is a bill, in fact there are several bills, for the restriction and control of the mail-order gun business. It was mentioned from Dallas that the belief was that the gun used in the presidential assassination had been ordered through a mail-order gun house. And it would seem to me that this would give some kind of an impetus to pushing that legislation through. It's been rather controversial up to now.
Of course, Peter, this particular type of weapon, a rifle, is not one that's particularly restricted in any cities or states around the nation. The laws, the local laws that regulate the carrying of weapons usually extend only to handguns, to revolvers and pistols that can be carried. Well, that's true, of course. And also, though, this law does extend to what we think we call them DWATs, don't we? The war souvenirs that are brought back, things like machine guns.
But the unfortunate part of the mail order gun business is that where it is required for a gun to be registered, the fact that a gun is sent through the mail from a mail order house, of course, is the secret that belongs to the purchaser. And if he wishes to go around with a gun and not register it illegally, that's up to him. And there are those who are trying to take steps against that.
And there are also those who are taking steps to prevent those steps from being taken.
Yes, they are. You mentioned before on another subject that the communists appear to be upset that there might be some tie-in, or at least some belief that the gentleman accused of the shooting had any tie-in with the Communist Party. I think it's a rather logical upset on the part of the communists, on the part of the Russians, on the part of Mr. Khrushchev. After all, for some time now, Mr. Kennedy had been dealing with Khrushchev. They knew each other. Khrushchev at least knew what Mr. Kennedy would do and would not do. I think he made it abundantly clear to him from time to time. And anyone else is something of an unknown quantity. There is an item just handed me apropos of this from Moscow. The newspaper Pravda is now charging that American right-wingers are trying to use the assassination of President Kennedy to stir up anti-Soviet and anti-Cuban hysteria. The organ of the Communist Party says Dallas police, for provocative purposes, are trying to pin it on U.S. communists. Pravda is skeptical about the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald and says the more details are reported, the darker and more suspicious all this story becomes. The newspaper is echoing charges first made last night by Radio Moscow, and it continues to paint Mr. Kennedy as the victim of opponents of efforts to improve East-West relations. I think this line of double-think reasoning is to be expected.
Well, it's true that they are engaging in double-think reasoning, and both the announcement from Moscow and the announcement here in New York made by Arnold Johnson, the party's public relations man, instead of just disclaiming any part of this man as one of them, is trying to insinuate that the whole plot was a right-wing plot, and that, as they even mentioned John Birchers as perhaps being involved in this thing. This seems rather callous to me. I don't know what the reaction is down there in Washington.
Well, it's of course callous, but on the other hand, it's probably the most expectable reaction we can get. If you were a Russian propagandist sitting in Moscow, presented with this particular event, I think your mind would turn to this excuse, this out, probably as fast as to any other. One point that interested me, to shift the subject again for a moment, Jim, I was privileged to be with Mr. Kennedy on a few occasions. Some of them involved his visits to space and missile installations, and I always marveled that this man had not only so much interest in what he was seeing, but so much grasp of it. He was, after all, the first so-called space-age president. He came in at a time when we were just barely scratching the surface of outer space. We had no idea what it was or where it would lead us. And within a matter of a few weeks and a few months, this man was talking with astronauts and talking with the scientific experts as if he was schooled in all of this. It's difficult for reporters to grasp some of the things that are going on, and yet here's a man who has the weight of the world on his shoulders and has to know foreign policy and taxes and agriculture. And he knew how some of these projects were working. He asked questions of the astronauts that made our questions look like grade school.
You know, it's interesting that you bring that up, because actually the death of President Kennedy has had some definite effect on our space program. In fact, it has split into 2 days the shots of an Atlas Centaur rocket and an interplanetary monitoring platform, both of them vital stepping stones in our goal of man conquest of the moon. Both of those shots originally were scheduled for Tuesday, but the National Day of Mourning has been declared for Mr. Kennedy on Monday will prevent the pre-launch operations being conducted as planned on that day on the Atlas Centaur. So the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, I understand, announced today at Cape Canaveral that it will close down all but essential operations at Cape Canaveral on Monday. So as a result, the firing of Atlas Centaur, the forerunner of a vehicle designed to land unmanned explorers on the moon, slipped 1 day back to Wednesday, sometime between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. And the imp launching was unaffected, will remain on the Tuesday slate, with the launching of the Delta booster scheduled between 9:30 at night and 11 p.m. The satellite is to, of course, evaluate whether orbiting instruments can be used to predict when great flares will erupt on the sun's surface, spewing giant clouds of cosmic rays into space as a threat to future astronaut lunar journeys. And I think we've got a good deal more to talk about. We'll be back with that after this message.
You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Turning to another phase of this story, earlier today there was some lack of knowledge on where President Kennedy would be buried. There was some speculation that he would be possibly buried in the family cemetery at Hyannis, and also speculation that he might be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Well, later this afternoon, we had the official announcement: President Kennedy will be buried in Arlington National Cemetery at the wish of the family. This was announced by Pierre Salinger, the White House press secretary. He said he couldn't pinpoint at this moment the exact site of the grave. Mr. Kennedy will become the second president to be buried in the wooded rolling cemetery just across the Potomac from the capital city. Former President William Howard Taft is buried at Arlington, the site of the Tomb of the Unknowns and the home of the Jefferson home there. Up until the time of the announcement made by Pierre Salinger, there had been almost a presumption that burial would be in Mr. Kennedy's native Massachusetts after some ceremony in Boston. But Mr. Kennedy's body will be taken to Arlington immediately after Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston, a personal friend of the assassinated chief executive, officiates at a solemn requiem funeral mass in Washington's St. Matthew's Cathedral on Monday. In addition to the funeral service, there will be graveside rites at the cemetery. Pierre Salinger said the route of the funeral procession will be announced tomorrow. He also reported that the family may permit television and radio broadcasts of the funeral mass. Now, we have heard no further word here in New York on that. And are you still with me, Peter Hackus, down in Washington?
Yes, Jim.
And have you heard anything further on this phase?
Nothing definite. Of course, we're hoping that this will be permitted. It strikes me as a rather selfless, not selfish, but selfless act on the part of the Kennedy family to permit burial in Arlington National Cemetery. An indication, perhaps, that the family feels that Mr. Kennedy really is a national figure more than a family figure. There, of course, for years, Kennedys have been buried in the family plot in Massachusetts. And the first instinct, I'm sure, from a selfish point of view, would have been to have the burial there with the family on hand and have it a rather quiet, private affair. I think it bespeaks a magnanimity, a feeling of perhaps patriotism, although that's always a corny word to use, on the part of the Kennedy family to have the late president buried in a place which can be visited by so many hundreds of thousands of Americans in years to come.
We were talking earlier, Peter, about this developing situation in Dallas, and I've been handed a bulletin which has some major significance, it seems to me. Dallas police said tonight they have in their possession photographs showing Marxist Lee Harvey Oswald holding the rifle that killed President Kennedy. This story came from Dallas just now, and I have an idea that this was the important development that Captain Will Fritz, the chief of homicide down in Dallas, was referring to earlier. At that time, he said he was not in a position to indicate what this development was, but I presume in the intervening time, the situation has changed so that this announcement could be made, and this is quite possibly the development that Fritz was talking about. We'll have more on that later on. Right now, this is Jim Hurlbut, NBC News, New York.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We pause now for station identification.
This is the Nation Station, WLW in Cincinnati.
This is Russ Ward in the NBC newsroom in New York, relieving my colleague Jim Hurlbut, who will be back at these microphones in a few short hours, early tomorrow morning. And it seems to me it might be fitting to bring you a recap of what has taken place in the last few minutes and the last few hours of this tragic story. From Washington, we learn that the new president, Lyndon Johnson, has scheduled a high-level conference tomorrow on the war in South Vietnam with Henry Cabot Lodge, the U.S. ambassador to Saigon, who is now in Washington. And from Dallas, a piece of rather startling news, Dallas police tonight said they have in their possession photographs showing Lee Harvey Oswald holding the rifle that killed President Kennedy. We'll be bringing you later developments on this aspect of the story from Dallas a few moments from now. It has been announced by the White House that President Kennedy will be buried Monday in Arlington National Cemetery. The Kennedy family decided this afternoon. Interment at the National Cemetery in Virginia, just across the Potomac from the capital city. William Howard Taft, the only other president buried there. It was announced tonight that Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy has requested a contingent of the Irish Army be present at her husband's funeral. The Dublin announcement said a party of 30 cadets will fly to New York City tomorrow on the same plane with the Irish president and his party. President Johnson, scheduled to address a joint session of Congress on Wednesday. The White House says he will make a major policy speech at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, we repeat the news from Dallas. Police there tonight say they have in their possession photographs showing Lee Harvey Oswald holding the rifle that killed President Kennedy. Earlier this afternoon, Homicide Chief Captain Will Fritz in Dallas said the case is cinched. He said there was a new development in this case since this morning. He was not in a position to reveal it, but he went on to say, we are sure of our case. Now, with this later word from Dallas, it would seem obvious this was the piece of cinching evidence he was making reference to, the photograph showing Lee Harvey Oswald holding the rifle that killed President Kennedy. Interestingly enough, Oswald arrested shortly after the assassination on charges of shooting a Dallas policeman. He was quickly linked to the murder that shocked the world, and now the announcement you've just heard from Dallas. We have Dean Braylis on the other end of the line, who will be coming to us shortly. If Dean Braylis will stand by a few moments, we'll be in touch with him on a new development from London. We'll have that for you momentarily. Right now, we repeat the word from the White House in London that President Kennedy will be buried Monday in Arlington National Cemetery. This decision made by the Kennedy family this afternoon at National Cemetery in Virginia, just across the Potomac. It had been presumed earlier that he would be buried at the family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts, but now the decision, Arlington National Cemetery. Pope Paul VI celebrated Mass for the soul of John F. Kennedy today. Francis Cardinal Spellman, Archbishop of New York, joined the pontiff in mourning the president's assassination and officiated at a funeral mass in Santa Susanna, the American Roman Catholic Church in Rome. Police are saying flatly in Dallas that Oswald, the pro-Castro Marxist and one-time defector to Russia, assassinated the president. They say he had no accomplices, though they continue to question several others, apparently in connection with the 24-year-old ex-Marine's movements before and after the sniper bullets that brought the president down. Homicide Chief Captain Will Fritz saying this case is cinched. A Marine Corps spokesman in Washington said Oswald's undesirable discharge, dated September 11, 1960, had been issued as a result of his attempt to renounce his United States citizenship in Moscow in the year 1959. We also learned from the White House in Washington that the late Mr. Kennedy's two small children were told last night that their father had been killed. It is not known what words were used to make them understand or who performed this task. We can only presume it was their mother, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. She stayed close beside her husband from the moment he was shot down until she arrived back in Washington with the late president's body. NBC bringing you continuous coverage of the developments that surround this tragedy that has affected the entire world. Even in the Soviet capital, television cameras set up in the embassy, the scene televised and broadcast throughout the Soviet Union. Later, for the first time, Soviet television picked up a direct transmission from the United States by way of the relay satellite to show Russians the body of the late president lying in state in the White House. It also showed the arrival of the casket accompanied by Mrs. Kennedy. We have further word now on this new development from Dallas. Let's go to Dallas and John Perryman.
Russ, the latest information we have is that the Dallas City Police say they have a photograph of Oswald holding a rifle with a telescopic sight. The rifle resembles the weapon used to assassinate President John F. Kennedy. We don't know if it can be determined if this is the same rifle that was found in the warehouse where the assassin shot the fatal bullets into the president. But they do have a photograph, they tell us, that shows Oswald holding a rifle as though aiming at something. When the picture was made, we don't know, but that is the latest information from the Dallas Police Department.
Tom, we assume that this was that cinching piece of evidence that was spoken of earlier today. Do you have any indication that there is still further evidence that might come to light during the next few hours?
Yes, I believe that the state will have more information than this, much of which will not be revealed until the trial, which, as you probably know, will be coming up in either late December or early January, possibly a little earlier. We believe they have information and evidence that will be brought up only when the trial begins.
Can you tell us, Tom, if an arraignment date has been set? An indictment, that is?
I believe that Oswald will be taken before the grand jury next week.
We
don't want to do this as hurriedly as they can understand, and next week, probably sometime, he will be taken before the grand jury.
We don't have a specific date on that, I imagine.
Not yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Tom. I hope we'll be in touch with you as these developments unfold your way. I'm sure we'll be back to you before the evening is out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Russ.
Again, we repeat, the late John F. Kennedy to receive a hero's burial Monday at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington. A burial to be followed by a solemn pontifical requiem mass at noon on Monday. The White House announced this late today. The family of the slain chief executive had decided on interment in the military cemetery just across the Potomac. Only one other president, William Howard Taft, is buried in Arlington. Great numbers of dignitaries from all parts of the world will be in Washington tomorrow and Monday for this final tribute to the late president. From Great Britain, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, Prince Philip, Harold Wilson, the head of the Labour Party. From France, President Charles de Gaulle, Maurice Coude de Mouville, the foreign minister. From West Germany, Ludwig Erhard, and Berlin Mayor Willy Brandt. Anastas Mikoyan, the first deputy premier of the Soviet Union, will be here.
Tomorrow night, Sunday, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, NBC Radio will present a special memorial program entitled The Highest Price, a 4-hour documentary of the life and times of our late President, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and an evaluation of the impact on history of his life and death. The Highest Price, tomorrow night, Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the NBC Radio Network.
NBC News continuing its coverage of the events surrounding the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And now we go to Washington for a further report on the burial of Mr. Kennedy from Ron Nesson.
The White House has announced that John Kennedy will be buried in Arlington National Cemetery across the Potomac River from Washington, rather than in the family burial plot in Brookline, Massachusetts. Arlington Cemetery tells NBC News that no exact spot has been picked yet for Mr. Kennedy's final resting place. But it is known that Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the late president's brother, Defense Secretary McNamara, and General Maxwell Taylor, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, went to Arlington in the rain this afternoon and looked at a plot which is on a grassy slope near the Custis Lee Mansion. This slope is very close to the grave of the only other president buried in Arlington, William Howard Taft.
Thank you, Ron.
We have a few more details.
Yes, go right ahead, Ron, please.
Russ. The plot is due north of the most famous spot in Arlington, which is the tomb of the unknown servicemen of World Wars I and II and of the Korean conflict. It looks out down across this grassy slope to the Memorial Bridge, Lincoln Memorial Bridge, which crosses the Potomac River, and then on the other side of that, the memorial to Abraham Lincoln, the other president assassinated.
Ron, let me ask you one question here. It's our understanding that the exact spot of the final resting place has not yet been determined. Am I correct in that belief?
That's what the Arlington Cemetery has just told us. But as I said, Attorney General Kennedy was there this afternoon looking at a spot, and servicemen were seen to be pacing off the ground and to be putting in stakes, and it's assumed that this is the spot where John Kennedy will be laid to rest. This is just about 75 paces down a hill from the Custis Lee Mansion, and this is a familiar landmark to millions of tourists who come to Washington and visit Arlington Cemetery. It was at one time a center of Washington and Virginia society. It was built by a grandson by marriage and adoption of George Washington. This grandson's name was George Washington Parke Custis, and he married a daughter he was related to Robert E. Lee. His son was Robert E. Lee. And this estate then was owned by Robert E. Lee, and when the Civil War came along, it was confiscated, and it was then turned into a national cemetery. And the place that Attorney General Kennedy and Defense Secretary McNamara and General Taylor were looking at this afternoon is just below this famous mansion.
I'm sure the thousands of worshipers and persons traveling to Washington on Monday to pay respects to the president will see this mansion you're talking about. It's a gorgeous landmark which is in full view as they drive across the famed Memorial Bridge. They're crossing the Potomac.
President Kennedy, as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, is, of course, entitled to a burial place in Arlington. He is also entitled, as a Navy veteran of World War II. Any veteran is entitled to be buried in Arlington, as are his wife and children.
Ron, we thank you for this information, and we'll be in touch with you momentarily on any further developing angles to the story. I might mention now that the 89-year-old former President Herbert Hoover has announced here in New York that due to a recent illness, he will not be able to journey to Washington on Monday to pay his respects to the President. The spokesman said the former President will be represented by his 60-year-old son, Herbert Jr., who had served as Undersecretary of State for 3 years during the Eisenhower administration. We had received a report earlier in the day that former President Truman would not be able to make it. That, of course, proved to be erroneous because Mr. Truman is in Washington this evening and has been there for several hours. The International Longshoremen's Association has asked its members not to report for work on Monday in observance of the National Day of Mourning that has been proclaimed by President Johnson. ILA President Thomas Gleason, in a statement released in Washington, also expressed the AFL-CIO union's grief over the tragic assassination of the great president. Safeway stores throughout the United States will be closed on Monday during the hours of President Kennedy's funeral. Leaders of a scheduled march for racial equality in St. Louis tomorrow say the demonstration will be a memorial to the assassinated president. A statement from the heads of the city's Conference on Religion and Race says the decision to make the procession of about 20,000 persons a memorial to the late president was reached last night. Today was proclaimed an official day of mourning throughout Yugoslavia. All sports events and entertainments canceled. All scheduled light radio TV programs changed to somber music and newspapers devoting pages and editorials to the event that occurred in Dallas yesterday. Genuine sympathy being expressed by people themselves. An estimated 10,000 lining up to sign the memorial book at the U.S. Embassy. We will add this note for the hundreds and thousands of persons who are flying the American flag on this unhappy occasion. The display of the flag by civilians in mourning for President Kennedy is provided for in a code adopted in 1924 by veterans and other organizations. The procedure is not covered by federal statute, but in general is similar to that is used by the military. The flag first is run up to the top or to the end of the pole and then lowered to the traditional half-staff position. And when it is taken off at the end of the day, the flag is again run up to the top and then lowered for removal. Further developments now as we hear from NBC's Peter Hackus in Washington.
Thus, even in her sorrow today, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy has thought of the problems facing a new First Lady and has offered to help. When Mrs. Johnson saw Mrs. Kennedy at the White House this morning, Mrs. Kennedy told her that she'd be glad to help in any way she possibly could. Mrs. Johnson spent about a half hour with Mrs. Kennedy. Mrs. Johnson then went back to her home in northwest Washington and apparently has no plans to see Mrs. Kennedy again for the rest of today. No statements have yet been made about when the Johnsons will move to the White House. And that, of course, it could be a matter of several days. I'm sure that the Johnson family is just not going to say a word about that and not push anything and not rush anything to allow Mrs. Kennedy as long a time as she needs and wants. Mrs. Johnson today, dressed in black, left her home at 10 o'clock this morning to go to the White House. She also went with her husband, the president, to St. John's Episcopal Church across Lafayette Square to memorial services, to tell those who may have tuned in just recently what the outlook is at the moment.
The President has scheduled a high-level conference tomorrow concerning the war in South Vietnam. He will be conferring with U.S. Ambassador to Saigon, Henry Cabot Lodge, Defense Secretary McNamara, Secretary of State Rusk, and McGeorge Bundy, the Special Presidential Assistant on National Security Affairs. The meeting will take place at 3 Washington time tomorrow, 3 p.m. Pierre Salinger, the White House News Secretary, says President Johnson will talk with Lodge, McNamara, and Rusk about their discussions last week in Honolulu on the progress of the anti-communist war in Vietnam. Mr. Johnson apparently wanting a first-hand account. The new president also has scheduled a White House intelligence briefing covering the world situation at about 10 o'clock in the morning. He and Mrs. Johnson will attend 11 a.m. services tomorrow, Sunday, at St. Mark's Episcopal Church here in Washington, after which the president will return to the White House. He will join the cortege that will carry the body of the late President Kennedy to the Capitol to lie in state until Monday morning. And to briefly run down that schedule, in case some people have just joined us, tomorrow at 1 p.m. Washington time, the late Mr. Kennedy's body will be moved from the White House to the rotunda of the Capitol in a formal procession, where it will lie in state for 1 day. Members of the President's family, the Cabinet, government leaders, members of the Supreme Court, and other high officials will be present at ceremonies placing the body in state mourning. Then the public will be permitted to file past the bier shortly after its arrival until 9 p.m. tomorrow evening, Washington time. On Monday, from 9 to 10 a.m., the public again will be permitted to file past the bier in the Capitol Rotunda. At 11 a.m., the body will be moved to St. Matthew's Cathedral. At 12 noon, a pontifical requiem mass will be celebrated by Richard Cardinal Cushing, the Archbishop of Boston. Services at the cathedral will be followed by graveside services and burial in Arlington National Cemetery. It has been reported, but for those who have joined us late, former Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of the late president, will not be attending the funeral of his son. The White House announces that the president's father, who is still bedridden because of a stroke he suffered 2 years ago, will remain at his Cape Cod home. Mrs. Rose Kennedy, the president's mother, will arrive here in Washington sometime tomorrow afternoon with her son, Senator Edward Ted Kennedy, and her daughter, Mrs. Eunice Shriver. It's reported that the elder Mrs. Kennedy, the late president's mother, was told the tragic news that her son was dead by a workman at the Kennedy compound who happened to hear it on the radio. Russ?
Peter, I'd like to ask if you have heard word in the last hour or two whether spectators are still lined up in Lafayette Square. I assume the rain has driven most of them away.
Well, it's an off-and-on rain, Russ. As you know, here in Washington, it can be raining 1 minute and dry the next. We had an exhibit of this morning, waiting for President Johnson to leave his home. The on-again, off-again. When it rains, it pours. And when it rains hard, the people are driven away, and miraculously, from out of nowhere, when it stops, they go by and do what they did before once again. So that in an on and off situation like that, it's hard to tell from moment to moment. But the crowds in Washington, as you well know, are rather persistent. And whether or not they can see anything going on or see any VIPs, they're rather persistent in their efforts, and they generally do remain unless the rain gets too difficult for them.
Peter, it's pouring down here in New York, and I got the impression as I came to the studios from the hotel that many New Yorkers, at least, are getting over the initial shock of the tragedy. I noticed a lot of people seemed to be going out for the evening, which certainly was not the case last night. Theaters in the city closed. The only businesses open were restaurants, and they did not seem to be doing much of a business. Is that the general feeling in Washington, or are the situations different? Is the grief still very much present there?
The situation, I'm sure, Russ, is much different. The entire city is
stunned, I think, is the only word you can use. The official part of the Washington that both of us know is so tied up in trying to understand what happened, the speed with which it happened, the enormity of the tragedy that has taken place, that I'm sure that there are many people, perhaps even some high government officials, to whom the full impact of what has taken place over the last 24 to 30 hours has not yet fully impacted. And I'm quite sure that it'll take some time. There is no resumption of normal activity in Washington as yet. Of course, the rain has had something to do with that.
Peter, thank you very much. We'll be talking to you again shortly. Let me repeat the latest word we have from Dallas. Quoting Dallas police, they say tonight they have in their possession photographs showing Lee Harvey Oswald holding the rifle that killed President Kennedy. Police now calling it an airtight case against the pro-Castro Marxist. The photographs of the rifle, when he was brought down from his cell in the Dallas City Jail to a room where he was shown the photographs, Oswald was the picture of confidence, smiling, loudly complaining about what he called police brutality and prison treatment. This was before he had seen the photographs. Afterwards, when he was taken back up to his cell, he was pictured as looking quite frightened. This is Russ Ward in the NBC Newsroom in New York.
For those local stations that might have some local news or public service announcements of local importance, we will provide stations with approximately 4 minutes for this purpose at 5 minutes before the hour and half hour. The network will, however, continue coverage during this period. The following is the cutaway cue. You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
We'll rejoin NBC for the...